The nightmare began with the death of Lena, who I will forever call my true wife, from pancreatic cancer. And the second chapter of grief began on an evening, 2 weekends ago, when I asked, was she telling the truth? About what? Riley replied. From the front room of Macy Manor, I stood and watched the snowfall beyond the window, watched white bury black. Meanwhile, Riley was sitting in her father's old armchair by the crackling fireplace and nursing a tumbler of brandy in loose fingers, clearly, like me, reflecting on everything. When Mr. and Mrs. Macy died in 2005, Riley inherited that lavish Edwardian house and became Lena's guardian. It was shortly after this that Lena, my childhood friend, finally admitted the truth. Lena told me that the two of you could see the spirits of your parents, I finally answered. Riley stared vacantly at the opposite side of the room, and I followed her gaze. My eyes fell upon an empty armchair with a still shadow sitting upon it. Strangely, the fireplace's animated flames cast dancing patches of darkness across every other surface in the room. My late wife's sister finally whispered, "A century ago, Ernest Macy built this home upon a dark hole in the ground. In his diary, he forbade descendants from ever entering the hole, for it took a terrible toll on him, a toll that nevertheless gifted the Macy family with the ability to see the specters of their lost loved ones. Of course, let's be honest, that gift will die with me. I'm the last of the Macy lineage, and I won't be having any children." Lena never mentioned a magical hole in the dirt, I said, trying to stifle a chuckle. "Because you always wear that shit-eating grin on your face, Artie," Riley replied, smirking as she tapping the heel of her foot against a dusty, leather-bound book on the coffee table. "This is Ernest's diary. I think that book's been sitting there since I first visited your home," I said. "Anyway, I've always respected your family's beliefs, Riley, but I've never seen any evidence of ghosts in this house." "Well, you're not a Macy," she replied. I nodded, pressing my palm against the outline of Lena's engagement band in my pocket. "No, not quite." Riley continued looking at that unsettling armchair, empty save for the heavy shade upon it. Then she coldly said, "Lena wants to show you, the best way she can show a non-Macy, that she's here." Without even thinking, I immediately replied, "I want to believe." "Lena, if you hear." The empty armchair interrupted me. It was flung upwards and flipped upside down, hurled against the white ceiling to which its base clung tightly. And I yelled, of course, as any rational person would. Veins protruded beneath my skin as I tightly clenched every muscle in my body. Only a second later, the paranormal chair fell and landed, kicking up a mound of dust in its overturned state on the floor. After an unknown length of silence, I croaked, "I felt her in this house, ever since she passed." "The dead never really leave this place," said Riley. "So grief is different for a Macy. Even for you, Artie. You're as good as family." "What if I actually had been a Macy?" I asked, eyes welling. "What if I'd married Lena and taken her name?" She nodded. "My mother married into the family, and she saw the faces of the dead." Then, without leaving an appropriate pause, I asked something horrific. "We should marry, you and me. That way, I'll be able to see her too." I expected ridicule or a scream of protest once Riley realized I was telling the truth, but she seemed to immediately detect the sincerity of my tone. Perhaps the thought had already crossed her mind. "Let's not go there, Artie," she warned. I turned to the overturned armchair, addressing the shadow I knew to be cast by my wife. "Lena, it would only be a marriage on paper. I'm not refusing on her behalf," Riley explained. "And you'd need to do more than legally change your surname. We would need to consummate the marriage, Artie." "Oh," came my meek voice, followed by the flipped armchair's disapproving creak. "Oh," Riley repeated, laughing. As in, "Oh, if only you could see the face your wife is pulling." I fell quiet after that, and my sister-in-law went up to bed a few minutes later. I, on the other hand, spent the rest of the night skim-reading Ernest's diary. Lena was reading alongside me, and I felt her excitement, which rivaled mine, as we read Ernest's section titled, The Plea of Two. A gust of wind rucked a chunk of the old brown page, rucked the passage which read, "To return a loved one's physical form, the ritual must be performed by two living members of the Macy family." However, I felt it in the air, felt that my wife wanted a second chance at life, and had she not, I wouldn't have pushed it, wouldn't have woken Riley and explained the situation at 4 in the morning. She quarreled with Lena about the ethics of it all, not so much marrying and sleeping with her late sister's husband, but resurrecting the dead. Lena and I should have listened, but we didn't, and Riley was, after only 10 minutes of arguing, corrupted by that desire to end our collective grief. If we don't try, I'd always regret it. My jaw hung. Does that mean Vegas is the quick option? My sister-in-law interrupted. And we'll consummate the marriage briefly. No lights. No talking. I nodded, sobbing joyously as I eyeballed the shadowy corner of the bedroom in which I knew Lena lurked. And a few days later, once Riley and I had successfully obtained ESTAs, we flew out to Vegas, signed the deed, did the deed. That greatest shame of our lives unfolded in an unlit hotel room for a little less than 10 seconds, and was followed by a long, silent flight back to England. A week after we'd hatched our plan, we returned to Macy Manor, drove along the driveway on a night darker and snowier than the formidable one on which we'd made this unnatural decision. All of that discomfort and regret washed away upon stepping across the threshold, however, because there she stood, blonde-haired in her unmistakable blue dungaree. She was a spectral light, burning blindingly into my retinas, that watched me from the main staircase. We ran towards one another, sobbing and professing our love as we did, and those tears only flowed more heavily as our arms ran through one another, as we realized, of course, that we could not touch. Of course, I reminded myself of the only reason that Riley and I had done what we did. We were going to bring Lena back. The ghost of my wife stood in the front room's doorway as Riley and I, holding hands, followed the instructions detailed within Ernest's diary. Two Macy members reciting the plea of two, begging for a dark thing, which we did not understand, to return Lena to us in physical form, begging that dark hole in the basement, which we were forbidden from even looking upon. I wondered whether every single Macy family member had, in fact, obeyed Ernest's strict rule. Surely, in the space of a century, somebody else had been down there. I was wrenched from my thoughts by the bulky diary slamming shut, a force which rattled the very house itself. In response, Riley and I gasped, turned to the doorway, then gasped again. Lena's phantom form wasn't there. Then came, from the entryway, a creak. Without any sense of self-preservation, I tiptoed towards the lobby, peered around the doorframe, and whimpered soulfully as I saw the basement door standing ajar. A door I had never, in the 20 years of visiting Macy Manor, seen open, and through the slight gap in the darkness of the basement staircase, there glowed a rather timid set of blue eyes that I would have recognized anywhere. They weren't translucent this time. "Lena," I wailed, feeling twice as euphoric as I had during our first reunion. "Hardy," Riley began as I rushed forwards, hints of uncertainty and fear in her raspy voice. I barely noticed anything other than the eyes of the woman I loved. I reached for the door handle with eager blindness, didn't even find it odd that Lena's blue eyes disappeared into the darkness as I threw the door open. I followed, bounced down wooden steps in that black, forbidden part of the manor, willfully ignored the stench of a smell that did not belong in the earthly realm. Riley was right. Grief is different for a Macy. Moonlight, invited inside by an empty slit of a window frame, revealed a black hole in the very floor of the basement. An ancient wooden door lay open, suggesting that Ernest had kept the supernatural opening under lock and key. But I cared for none of that. The moonlight, most importantly, revealed Lena. All in that place was a dream. From my unthinking head to my light toes, for I was floating, perhaps literally, towards the physical embodiment of my wife. It was only as our lips met that the vision began to sour. There came a feeling that had been trying to bubble to the surface from the moment Riley and I had completed the plea of two. Terror. Warmth filled my mouth, a black warmth violating my senses, having circumvented my defenses. And when I opened my eyes, I screamed. A scream muffled by her mouth. I looked into eyes no longer brown, but black. A ravenous black that swallowed the irises, then the entirety of the eyes. Her muscular fingers dug deeply into my upper arms, preventing my escape, and then she began to step backwards, began to reverse into the hole, taking me with her. It had all been a lie. The plea of two was never going to bring anybody back. It brought something else out of the hole, and that made me fear what other lies the blackness had told Ernest Macy, what terrifying rituals he might have performed. There came footsteps down the stairs, and I saw Riley in the glossy reflection of the demon's black eyes. Saw her come so close to reaching me, before being tossed, like a ragdoll, against the far wall of the basement. The toes of my trainers start to slip into the unholy darkness, and I felt a chill beyond coldness, something that no human knows how to feel. I closed my eyes and prayed that I would meet an end. I had a feeling that surviving in that black place would be the worst nightmare imaginable. Whilst blind to the world, however, I was startled to feel that creature's lips and nails released my frail body, letting me fall backwards onto the basement floor, and I opened my eyes to see something horridly beautiful. White hands, stemming from a form that brightly illuminated the dingy basement, were knotted within the false Lena's hair, and those hands began to push the deceitful creature's head downwards, casting the creature back to the black world. I sobbed as the ghost of the true Lena, steel shackles binding her wrists and neck to the black realm below, revealed her form behind the creature she was submerging into the darkness, into the nightmarish world which was claiming Lena's bound, ghostly form too. "I love you," she mouthed tearfully. I reached out helplessly as Lena's teary eyes slipped into the opening, following the thing she had vanquished. Then the wooden trapdoor swung closed. For days, I have felt a deeper grief than before, a grief worsened by my inability to move forwards. Riley had been right all along. I don't eat. I don't sleep. I sit in her front room, eyeing the many dead faces of the Macy family. But there is only one I hope to see, even if that hope rots my insides. If she doesn't walk through that door soon, I will find a way to bring her. I've never talked about this before. I'm not even sure why I'm posting it now, except that it's been eating at me for years. Maybe someone here will believe me, or maybe I just need to get it out. Either way, this is the truth, as much as I can make sense of it. When I was 7, my mom died. It was sudden, an aneurysm. She collapsed in the middle of the kitchen, and by the time the ambulance arrived, she was gone. My dad didn't know what to do. He was this big, quiet guy who'd worked the same warehouse job for years, and after Mom died, he just froze. A few months later, he packed up my little brother Dallas and me, and moved us to a mining town in West Virginia. He'd gotten a new job, something that kept him away for long hours, and left him too tired to talk most nights. The town was tiny, just a cluster of houses, a single gas station, and this old K-12 school that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s. It smelled like mildew and old chalkboards, and the floors creaked with every step. There were only 2 teachers for my grade, and they were so strict that I'd nearly have a panic attack if they so much as looked disappointed in me. The rules were everything at that school. If you didn't follow them, you were warned. If the initial warnings didn't work, you'd hear the same threat: "Don't make me send you to the goodness room." At first, I thought it was just a story, something to scare us into behaving, like the Bougie Men. The other kids acted like it was no big deal, even laughing about it sometimes. "The goodness room's just the janitor's closet," one kid said. Another whispered it was where they made kids sit in the dark until they cried. No one really knew, and none of us were brave enough to find out. Then Jacob got sent there. Jacob was this wiry, loudmouth kid who was always getting into trouble. He'd steal pencils off desks, shout dumb jokes during class, and talk back to teachers like he didn't care what happened to him. I think we all secretly admired him for that. But one day he went too far. It was during math. Mrs. Granger, our teacher, was already annoyed with Jacob for humming loudly while she was explaining long division. Then he made some smart remark about her old lady perfume, and she snapped. "That's it," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Jacob, you're going to the goodness room." He froze, and for the first time, I saw fear flicker in his face. "What?" "No, I'll stop." Two men appeared at the door, dressed in suits that didn't match the peeling walls of the classroom. Without a word, they walked in, grabbed Jacob by the arms, and dragged him out. He screamed, kicking and thrashing. But they didn't flinch. The door slammed shut behind them, and the room went dead silent. None of us said a word for the rest of the day. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Jacob didn't come back to class the next day, or the day after that. The first day, we all just assumed he'd been suspended. He was always in trouble, and a couple of days at home didn't seem out of the ordinary. But by the third day, kids started whispering. "What if he's still in the goodness room?" One girl asked during lunch, her voice barely audible over the clatter of trays. "No way," a boy replied, his tone dismissive. "They're not allowed to keep you there that long." My cousin got sent once, and he was back in class the same day. "What happened to him?" I asked, but the boy just shrugged. The whispers stopped when Jacob finally walked back into class on Friday. At first, we were relieved. He wasn't hurt or crying. But then we got a better look at him. Jacob wasn't the same. He didn't crack jokes or smile like he used to. His face was blank, his eyes dull, like all the light had been sucked out of him. He didn't even flinch when Mrs. Granger barked at him to sit down. When recess came, the usual chaos of kids running around the playground didn't touch him. He just sat on the bench, staring straight ahead. A couple of us gathered around him, trying to figure out what had happened. "Where were you?" one of the girls asked. Jacob's eyes flicked toward her for a second before he muttered, "I was in the goodness room." His voice was flat, mechanical. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled the collar of his shirt higher up his neck, like he was trying to hide something. But we'd already seen it. A small black number printed at the base of his neck. "What's that?" another boy asked, pointing. Jacob's hand shot up to cover the tattoo. "Nothing," he mumbled. "Did they do that to you in the goodness room?" I pressed. Jacob froze for a moment, then nodded ever so slightly. "I'm not supposed to talk about it," he whispered. "Not about the room. Not about my assignment." "Assignment?" I repeated, confused. He didn't elaborate. Instead, he stood up abruptly and walked back toward the school building. That night, I told my dad everything. We were sitting at the kitchen table. Dallas was upstairs in bed, and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. I told him about the goodness room, about Jacob and the tattoo. My dad sighed and rubbed his face. He looked so tired. "It's probably just some disciplinary thing, Emmett," he said. "Some schools do that. Scare the kids a little so they straighten up." "But Dad..." "Look, I know you're upset, but I need you to focus on yourself, okay? Don't get in trouble, and you won't have to worry about any of this." I wanted to argue, to make him understand how wrong it all felt, but I could tell he wasn't really listening. His job at the mine was hard, and I knew he was doing his best just to keep us afloat. So I dropped it, but I couldn't stop thinking about Jacob and his tattoo. In the days that followed, I watched him closely. He never spoke unless a teacher called on him, and even then, his answers were short and robotic. He never played during recess, never smiled, never laughed. It was like someone had flipped a switch in his head and turned off everything that made him unique. That made him Jacob. The worst part was the way the teachers treated him. They didn't scold him or even look annoyed anymore. It was like he'd become their perfect student, the kind they always wanted. The other kids started avoiding him. At first, I thought it was because they didn't want to be around someone so strange. But I realized it was more than that. They were scared. And honestly, so was I. For a little while, things at school went back to normal. Well, as normal as they could get under the circumstances. I kept my head down, stuck to the rules, and tried not to think about the goodness room. But then it happened to Dallas. It started during art. Dallas was in second grade, and his class had been painting something for Thanksgiving. Turkeys, I think. He was always kind of clumsy, and when he got excited, his arms flailed like crazy. One wrong move, and he knocked over a jar of red paint, spilling it all over another kid's project. The teacher, Mrs. Kirkland, lost it. She yelled at Dallas, called him careless, and told him to clean it up. I wasn't there to see it, but one of his classmates told me later that Dallas started crying, apologizing over and over. That didn't stop her. By the end of the day, I was waiting for Dallas at the bus stop like usual, but he didn't show up. Dread welled up inside me as the bus came and went, leaving me standing there alone. Something terrible had happened. I knew it. I ran home as fast as I could, bursting through the door and shouting for Dad. He was already in the kitchen, his face pale and grim. "Where's Dallas?" I asked, breathless. "He's still at school," Dad said quietly. "Why?" Dad hesitated. The teacher called me, said he got sent to some room, the goodness room. My eyes widened. "Dad, you have to go get him." "I tried," he said. "I called, but they said it's part of their discipline policy. Like after-school detention. They wouldn't let me pick him up early." Dallas didn't come home until after dinner. The instant he walked through the door, I knew something was wrong. His eyes were empty, his shoulders slumped, just like Jacob, and he didn't say a word. I ran up to hug him, but he stepped back, like he didn't even recognize me. Dallas," I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Then I saw it, a small black number tattooed at the base of his neck, just like Jacob's. "What did they do to you?" I choked out. He glanced at me, his face blank, and said, "I'm not supposed to talk about it." Dad tried to get him to eat, to talk, to show some sign of his old self, but Dallas just sat there, staring into space. Finally, Dad slammed his fist on the table and stood up. "That's it," he said. "I'm going to the school." I tried to stop him. "Dad, they won't tell you anything. They'll just—" "I don't care," he shouted, grabbing his coat. "They can't do this to my son." He stormed out, leaving Dallas and me alone in the quiet, dimly lit kitchen. I wanted to cry, to scream, to do something. Anything. But all I could do was sit there, staring at my brother, who didn't even seem to realize I was in the room. Dad didn't come back until late that night. When he walked in, I could tell something had happened. His face was pale, his eyes unfocused. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in just a few hours. "Dad?" I asked hesitantly. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, swaying slightly, like he was trying to remember how to speak. Then he slowly rolled up the sleeve of his shirt. There, on his wrist, was a black tattoo. My blood ran cold. "No," I whispered. What did they do to you?" He looked at me, and for a split second, I thought I saw tears in his eyes. But then his expression shifted, smoothing out into something vacant and unfamiliar. "You need to be a good boy, Emmett," he said, his voice low and hollow. "Do as you're told at school. Don't ask questions." I shook my head, backing away, struggling to hold back tears. "Dad, this isn't you. They did something to you, didn't they?" But he didn't respond. He just turned and walked into his bedroom, leaving me alone with Dallas. For the next few days, it was like living with strangers. Dallas and Dad went about their routines like nothing had happened, but neither of them smiled or laughed. They barely spoke to me unless it was to tell me to behave. I felt like I was losing my mind. Whatever the goodness room was, it wasn't just some disciplinary measure. It was changing people, taking something from them. And I knew it was only a matter of time before I was next, and I wasn't about to sit around and wait for it to happen. For the next few days, I made sure to stay out of trouble at school. I didn't speak unless spoken to. I avoided eye contact, but I was always watching, listening. The teachers seemed different now. They didn't raise their voices as often and didn't bother with the usual lectures or detentions. The threat of the goodness room was all they needed. If a kid even looked like they might act out, the teacher would pause, fix them with a cold stare, and say, "Do you want to visit the goodness room?" No one argued anymore. At home, things had gotten worse. Dad barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was only to remind me to be good. Dallas remained quiet and distant, like a doll going through the motions of being alive. Every time I saw that tattoo on the back of his neck, I felt sick to my stomach. Before long, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening. One night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I made up my mind to take matters into my own hands. I packed a flashlight, a screwdriver, and a pocket knife into my school backpack. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I slipped out the back door and made my way to the school. The air was cold and sharp, the only sounds the crunch of my sneakers on the gravel road and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The school looked even more ominous at night. The windows were dark, and the peeling paint on the walls seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. I hesitated at the entrance, my hand hovering over the doorknob, before finally pushing it open. The hallways were silent, the fluorescent lights flickering faintly overhead. I kept my footsteps light, moving toward the back of the school where I'd seen Jacob taken that day. Eventually, I found it. A heavy metal door at the end of a dim hallway. There was no label on it, just a small keypad. The goodness room. I had no idea what the code was, but I tried the handle anyway. Locked. I crouched down and used the screwdriver to pry open the panel on the side of the keypad. Inside was a mess of wires, and I had no idea what I was doing, but I was prepared to break the door down if I needed to. Fortunately, it didn't come to that. After a few minutes of fumbling with the wires, the lock gave a soft click, and the door creaked open. The smell hit me immediately, the scent of antiseptic and iron, like blood. I shined my flashlight into the room, and my breath hitched. Whatever the place was, it sure as hell wasn't a janitor's closet. The room was cramped and sterile, with stark white walls. In the center, a single metal chair was bolted to the floor, straps hanging loosely from the armrests and footrests. Above it, there was a mechanical arm tipped with a needle-like tool. Nearby, a table held a variety of surgical instruments I didn't recognize. On the far wall, a monitor displayed a list of names and numbers, many of them crossed out. I saw Jacob's name there. Dallas's too. I felt like I was going to throw up. "What are you doing here?" The voice startled me so badly that I almost dropped my flashlight. I turned to see one of the teachers, Mr. Keller, standing in the doorway. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but I could see the anger in his eyes. I just wanted to see. I stammered. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, stepping into the room. Behind him, 2 men in suits appeared. Before I could run, they grabbed me, dragging me toward the chair. I screamed and kicked, but they were too strong. They strapped me in, tightening the restraints around my wrists and ankles until I couldn't move. The needle on the mechanical arm began to glow faintly, and the arm moved toward me. "No," I yelled, struggling against the straps. "Let me go." But they didn't listen. One of the men pressed a button, and the needle lowered toward the base of my neck. I felt a sharp sting, like the prick of a bee, and then the strap on my right wrist snapped. I didn't think, I acted. I yanked my arm free and grabbed the needle, pulling it away before it could go any deeper. One of the men lunged at me, but I swung the flashlight, hitting him square in the face, sending him reeling and clutching his nose. I freed my other hand and tore off the ankle straps, scrambling out of the chair as fast as possible. The men shouted, but I didn't stop. I ran past them, out into the hallway and through the front doors. The cold air assaulted my senses, but I never stopped, not once. I didn't even look back. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs ached. Soon school disappeared behind me, replaced by endless fields and dark woods. I kept going, driven by pure adrenaline, and the thought that if I slowed down, they'd catch me. Eventually, headlights appeared in the distance. A car. No, a police cruiser. I stumbled into the road, waving my arms frantically. The cruiser slowed, and the officer inside stepped out, shining a flashlight on me. "Kid, what the hell happened to you?" he asked. I tried to answer, but all I could do was gasp for air. "It's okay," the officer said, guiding me into the car. "You're safe now." But I didn't feel safe. Not yet. Not while the goodness room still existed. The officer drove me toward my house, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to believe I might be okay. The adrenaline was fading, and exhaustion was winning out. My head rested against the cool window as the cruiser rumbled over the gravel road. When we turned onto my street, though, my heart dropped. Red and orange flames lit up the sky above my house. No, I thought. It couldn't be. My house was on fire. Fire trucks were already there, doing their best to quell the inferno. Smoke billowed into the air, and neighbors stood outside, staring at the scene. The officer slammed on the brakes and bolted out of the car. I followed, my legs shaking as I stumbled toward the crowd. "No," I whispered, the word catching in my throat. One of the firefighters tried to stop me. "Kid, stay back. You can't. My family's in there," I screamed, trying to push past him. He grabbed me, holding me back. "It's too late. We're still putting it out, but ain't no one coming out of that. I'm so sorry." I stopped struggling, my knees buckling beneath me. The heat from the flames felt like it was crawling over my skin. Dallas. Dad. Gone. Everybody gone. I sat on the curb as the fire raged on. The officer tried to ask me questions, what had happened, where I'd been, but I couldn't speak. My throat was raw, my world shattered. I just stared at the house, the home I'd shared with my family, as it crumbled before my eyes. When the flames finally died down, they recovered 2 bodies. The coroner was thoughtful, wrapping them up gently. I didn't need to see them to know. My dad, my brother, dead. The police later ruled it was an electrical fire, likely caused by faulty wiring. It was a tragic accident, the report said, but I knew better. I overheard one of the investigators say something about the bodies, how they were burned so badly that there was almost nothing left to identify them. Any trace of the tattoos they'd had, the ones I'd seen myself, were gone. And along with them, any hope of proving what had happened to them. It felt deliberate. Someone wanted to erase my family, to make sure there was no evidence tying them and their deaths to the school, to the goodness room. The next few weeks were a blur. Social workers came and went, offering me condolences and promises they couldn't keep. I was sent to live with a foster family in another town, far away from the school. I tried to tell the police about the goodness room, about what the school was doing, but no one really believed me. The goodness room. One officer asked, raising an eyebrow, "Are you sure it wasn't just some detention program?" "They tattooed them," I insisted, my voice shaking. "They did something to them in there. Something awful. My dad, he wasn't the same anymore. Not after what they did to him. But they just gave me those pitying looks, the kind adults give when they think a kid's struggling to cope with trauma. When it became clear I wasn't going to take no for an answer, they finally agreed to interview the school staff. They denied everything. "The goodness room isn't real," the principal said, shaking her head. "It's like an urban legend. something the kids made up to scare each other. The teachers backed her up. They claimed Jacob Dallas and I were troublemakers, prone to exaggerating. Speaking of Jacob, I tried to find his family, but they were gone. Moved away, according to the neighbors. No forwarding address, no phone number. It was like they'd vanished. I didn't know what to think anymore. Decades later, I still don't understand what happened. Was the goodness room some kind of experiment or a punishment? Or something worse? I'll never forget the look in my dad's eyes when he came home that night, or the way Dallas had been hollowed out, replaced by someone that looked an awful lot like my brother, but wasn't. I've kept quiet over the years, and I've put a lot of miles between myself and the school. Sometimes, though, I wonder if the teachers, the principal, and the men in suits are still out there, waiting to finish what they started. I worry that even after all this time, they're just waiting for me to slip up, to stop behaving myself, and that I'll wake up to find myself back in that room, with a number on my neck. If you've ever been to a school like mine, or heard whispers from your neighbors, or, God forbid, your own children, about a place like the goodness room, please, I'm begging you, run. Get as far away as you can, and do it now, before it's too late. Because whatever it is, it doesn't just punish you. It takes something. And once it does, you never get it back. I am not guilty, but I wish I was. For the previous 5 years, I've received a letter on November 20th from the state penitentiary. He's never forgotten my birthday. Never forgotten anything, actually. He has one of those memories. Not photographic. I can't recall the name off the top of my head, but it's the one where you remember everything you've ever seen or read. Anyway, a true genius. And though I hadn't been able to stomach a visit where I'd have to sit across from the monster wearing my brother's skin, I still accepted his letters. Because for a moment, while I pored over the neatly scripted words, I could repress what he did. For a moment, I could just remember him as he was when we were children, the smartest person I'd ever known, and my best friend. Not the murderer, not the devil. I was only 15 when they put him away for 2 consecutive life sentences. That afternoon will be burned in my brain forever. Coming home from school, the smell of iron when I entered the house, the sound of my brother sobbing in their bedroom, the sight of my parents' bodies, shredded beyond recognition. It was the day I became an orphan. He never spoke a word in his defense, never gave an explanation, and I never forgave him. But even considering I didn't respond, he continued to write my annual birthday message, often recounting some happy memory from our childhood, filled with apologies I didn't care to hear. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The first arrived after he'd been locked up for just a few months. I moved in with my grandmother after my parents' deaths and was struggling in school. It was hard to focus on anything other than it, especially because I had no answers as to why it happened. My brother loved my parents, and they loved him. There was never anger or abuse in our household. Richard was lined up to go to MIT in the fall. We were happy. The only clue I had was that about a month before it transpired, Richard's behavior changed. He stopped hanging out with his friends, retreated to his room right when he got home, and would only come out for meals. And normally we'd play video games or chess together in the evenings, but we hadn't exchanged so much as 2 words with each other in weeks. Also, he was jumpy. Could be startled by a butterfly-level jumpy. My parents and I chalked it up to nerves about going away to college, but after they were gone, I wondered if he hadn't known what he was going to do and was just working up the courage to do it. Maybe he'd always been a monster, or maybe something simply snapped. Whatever the case, I hoped he would finally explain things in his letter, as we hadn't spoken since the day he was arrested. But I was disappointed. All it read was, "Happy birthday, Jason. I wish I could be there. It's hard to believe still that I'll never celebrate another one with you outside of here, and I'm sorry that it has to be like this. There is so much I want to tell you, but for now, all that matters is that you're safe, and I'd rather focus on happier thoughts. I still remember Mom and Dad bringing you home from the hospital. You were so tiny, and I was terrified that I'd drop you. I practiced holding bags of flour in the mirror to hone my technique. You were such a gift to us, so precious, so small. And now you're a fully grown man. 16 is such a fun age. Grandma told me she got you a car. Be careful out there, but also tear it up a little bit. I miss you, but I understand why you have not come to see me. Please know how deeply I regret what happened and how terrible I feel for the impact their deaths had on you. I don't fault you for your feelings towards me. I would not forgive me either. But I love you, and I always will. Richard, I'm not sure what I expected. It's not like anything he would have said would have made it all better. Yet, I still found myself hollow when I finished reading. Partially due to the bitterness I felt towards him, and partially due to the guilt I felt for leaving him to rot in there without so much as a hello from me. For 15 years, my entire life, Richard was my best friend. He watched over me, protected me from bullies, taught me more than I ever learned in school. He was everything I aspired to be. No matter how much I wanted to hate him, and no matter how horrified I was at what he'd done, I missed him too. But I was 16. I had friends and a car. It was easier for me to paint him as despicable and deserving of his fate. My grandma quickly learned to stop asking whether I come with her to the prison. It's possible she said something to him about giving me some time to come around. It's possible he inferred by my lack of reply that it was best to keep his distance. Either way, it wasn't until my next birthday that I heard from him again. Happy birthday, Jason. Another year gone past. I hope you are well. Prison life is a lot duller than they make it out in the movies. Mostly I play chess and board games with other men serving life sentences. As none of us have any hope of release, we just whittle away the days waiting for the end. It's tedious, but I'm okay. All I need is to know that you're safe and you're happy to get me through the long hours. If you can never stomach direct contact, the updates from Grandma will be enough for me, but it would be great to hear from you. I know it's only been a couple birthdays, but it already feels like ages that we've been apart. I mean, you're 17 already. Soon you'll be graduating. The little boy that used to stalk me and my friends around the neighborhood all day is nearing adulthood. You're going to go on to do something incredible. I just know it. You were always the better of the two of us. I love you, Richard. I never understood why he, the most intelligent person to ever come out of our small town, thought so highly of me, but he used to say that smarts weren't everything. His brains didn't much matter anymore anyway. All of his talents were going to waste. His highest aspiration likely to be becoming the prison chess champion. And I was doing my best on the outside to get back to some semblance of normalcy. 17 was an interesting age for me. I got my first girlfriend, had my first beer. Things I wished I could share with him, especially once I managed to turn things around in school and pull my grades up. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to have my brother back. But every time I even got close, the image of him smiling or laughing was rapidly replaced by that of him covered in blood. And what happened next did not help. 8 months after my 17th birthday, they found Richard's cellmate ripped to pieces. Even though there was a mountain of evidence against him, and even though he had pled guilty to the charges, I had always held on to some level of doubt that he had actually murdered our parents. Call me an apologist, but a little safe space in my brain created scenarios in which someone broke in, committed the atrocity, and my brother was just too traumatized to recall it properly. But there was no denying it now. Same method, same man left alive afterwards. No one else with access to their cell that night. He was a killer, a cold-blooded killer. How my grandma continued to visit him was beyond me, but she always said, "He'll never stop being my grandson." Love is a strange thing. In that same spirit, I couldn't bring myself to throw out his next letter when it inevitably arrived. And so, instead I read, "Happy birthday, Jason. I hate to start off with morbidity, but I'm sure you've heard what happened to my cellmate. I don't care what anyone else thinks of me, but I haven't been able to sleep with the burning notion that you may be even more disgusted with me now than you were before. I won't make any excuses or claim there was a mistake. I just want you to know that what happened to him, and what happened to our parents, does not truly reflect who I am. I may be flawed, but I am not an evil person. There's not much more I can say in my defense. Guilty and innocent are relative terms. In any regard, they're going to isolate me from now on, probably for the best. I told them not to put me in a double in the first place. I wish I could take everything back, but as I can't, I only wanted to wish you a happy 18th birthday and congratulate you on getting into your dream college. You killed it, despite everything. Finished with honors, a huge scholarship. I'm so proud. You being out there and living your best life is what keeps me going. I love you, Richard. Guilty and innocent are relative terms. What a cop-out. Again, he didn't deny his involvement, but he didn't exactly admit to the act either. I found myself furious, too, that he'd effectively described my orphanhood as being due to him being flawed. FLAWE. How about sick? How about asterisked up? Or yeah, how about evil? I couldn't comprehend that with 3 bodies under his belt, horribly mutilated bodies, that he would try to claim that he wasn't an evil person. How the 2 of us had been raised in the same household under the same tutelage and come out with such wildly different moral compasses baffled me. I didn't want his congratulations or his pride in me. All of my successes over the previous 2 years were my own, despite everything. I just wanted him to go away. I wanted to never hear from him again. That day, I swore I wouldn't open any more of his correspondence. Swore I'd have Grandma tell him not to send any more mail. But she wore me down over the next year. She told me that he was not doing well in isolation. Looked thinner every time she went up there. I brushed her off until she showed me a photo of the 2 of them from her most recent trip. He looked like a completely different person. The blue eyes that used to pierce through you were now sunken and dark. His deep brown hair was now flecked with gray, unkempt, and thinning. It was hard to believe that the man standing next to Grandma was nearly 60 years her junior. He had aged enormously. Again, I felt the hollow guilt at refusing to give him even the dimmest hope that he still had a brother that loved and supported him. And as she told me it was the only thing he was looking forward to, I decided, at least, not to tell her to stop him from writing to me. Away at college when the next came in, I received his letter a day late through the university mail, and I waited until my roommate left me alone before unfolding it on my desk. Happy birthday, Jason. Hopefully I got your new address right. Grandma was pretty sure she gave me the correct dorm room number. There's not much to update on my end. I'd be lying to say it's been great for me, but I'm getting by. I read a lot, and at least the guards treat me relatively well, given what I'm in here for. But today is a good day. Writing to you is the highlight of my year. It always makes me nostalgic for when we were kids. Things were simpler then. Sitting down to pen this, I tried to think of my favorite memory of you, and I landed on when we found Buttons starving in the backyard, a helpless little kitten, and you nursed her back to health, eventually made her the fattest cat on the block. You were so gentle, so caring, relentless in your efforts to save her. Sounds like she's doing well now living with Grandma. I'm glad for that. Also, sounds like you're doing incredible in college. I'm glad for that too. Your last year as a teenager. I know your studies are important, but don't forget to let yourself have some fun. I really miss you, bro. It's been torture to spend these years without you. I love you, Richard. It was rich of him to use the term torture knowing what he put others through. But rather than the fury I'd felt reading some of his previous words, I was surprised by my reaction. I began to sob, and sobbing turned into torrents of emotion long overdue for release. It was the cat, the stupid cat, my wonderful, beautiful little baby. If his goal was to drag up a memory that might spark deep repressed feelings of compassion for him, he'd chosen well. He was giving me all the credit But we'd worked in shifts those first few days to keep Buttons alive, until we were certain she was healthy enough to spend even a minute alone. Now, away at college, and away from her furry little face, I wept lonely tears. Missing her, missing my grandma, missing Mom and Dad, missing him. But it was his fault. It was his fault that he was locked up, his fault that Mom and Dad were gone. His fault. My sympathy waned quickly, and I vowed again not to forgive him. For another year, he'd receive only silence from me. Being away at school, Grandma could not hound me as often to display empathy towards him. College was rife with distractions, and before I knew it, another year passed. Another letter was delivered. Happy birthday, Jason. Welcome to your 20s. I'm not sure where to begin this year. Since I wrote last, things have deteriorated. I know I've said in the past that it's okay for you not to write back, and it's okay that you don't visit, but I'd really like to see you. Please. You must be so angry with me. You deserve to be. But just one time, I want to see your face again, even if there's only hatred in your eyes. Maybe you could come with Grandma. Attached are the dates she plans to visit next year. Maybe you can match one of them up with a school break. Please. I need you, Jason. I love you, Richard. Grandma warned me that this one might be different. The only word she could think to describe him anymore was desperate. She was worried about him. Wouldn't even send me the most recent photo they took together. And it scared me. Whatever my feelings towards him, I was not ready for him to die too. He was the last remaining member of my immediate family. The last remaining tie that I had to my life before. Maybe it had been long enough. Maybe I would be able to put enmity aside to meet his wishes. I checked the dates he provided, and there wasn't one that lined up well with any of my breaks. And I didn't feel right, after all this time, writing him a letter. If I was going to communicate with him, it was going to be face to face. For the next year, I really did plan to make it to the prison. But whenever Grandma went, I was busy with schoolwork or finals, or at the internship that I was working over the summer. Of course, part of me wasn't trying very hard to move my schedule around. The part of me that was terrified to look him in the eyes. It always seemed like there'd be more time. He was young. I told myself he wouldn't just waste away so easily. Yet on my birthday this year, no letter arrived. It had been delayed before, and I had moved to a new apartment, so I considered that maybe it had been lost in the mail. But on November 22nd, Grandma received a call from the prison. Richard was dead. He'd hung himself in his cell. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. They asked her what she wanted to do with the body. I was in shock the entire time she talked through the options with me over the phone. Though it didn't take long for my shock to convert to rage. He'd taken my parents from me, and now he'd left me too. Left without ever explaining, without ever telling me why. I was empty, and I didn't care what they did with him. Grandma asked if we should try to get him a plot close to our parents, but I convinced her that that was wrong. Him having eternal rest near the people whose lives he'd stolen. It was egregious. I was all for throwing him in the prison graveyard, but Grandma wouldn't have it. I'm not sure the prison would have agreed to it anyway, given their limited space. Eventually, we came to a compromise that we'd bury him in the plot next to hers and Grandpa's as it was available, and we informed the prison that we take ownership of his body. So, for the first time since he was incarcerated, I traveled with Grandma to the prison as there was paperwork that we both needed to sign for the funeral home to retrieve his remains. The 2-hour trek through windy, mountain roads gave me a new appreciation for my grandmother. For over 5 years, she'd made the drive countless times, alone, just to give a felon a little comfort. I felt the hollow guilt again that I'd always made her do it all by herself. But it didn't last long. Soon, it was replaced with curiosity. Because when they gave us the few possessions that he'd kept in his cell, they also handed me a letter. My name was on the front. The correct address, too. He'd clearly tried to post it to arrive on my birthday, as usual, but they'd never let it out of the prison. When I asked them why they hadn't sent it, They explained that, per standard procedure, it had been opened, and they needed to investigate it further before it was sent out. However, given my brother's passing, they no longer deemed it necessary to review. Wondering why this letter would have warranted any further study than his previous birthday wishes, I opened it there in the office and understood immediately. It contained no words of apology or happy childhood memories. At least none that could be discerned right away. It contained no words at all actually. Scribbled on the neatly folded page in my brother's handwriting was a list of number sets, with each containing one number followed by a dash, followed by a second number. 1x3xx1xx. It went on, and at first, I had no idea what to make of it. I could see why they'd stopped it, as they probably thought he was trying to plan an escape or some other criminal activity using a coded message. They watched me scan the lines for signs of recognition in my eyes, signs that I knew something they didn't, but finding that I was just as confused by it as they were, they shrugged and let us leave. More pissed off than I was before, I cursed Richard for giving me gibberish as a final birthday wish before he offed himself, surmising that his mind might have broken from being in isolation for so long. But while Grandma rumbled the car along, I opened the letter again and inspected it more closely. The first number before a dash was always 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, but the second ranged from 1 to over 200. They were clearly references to something, a cipher of some kind, but Richard hadn't provided a key for it, unless he already had the letters, 5 previous letters, 5 keys. Possibly, I considered, each number set referred to a word in them. Excitedly, I thought back to each of them and recalled that all 5 started exactly the same way. Happy birthday, Jason. The first set of numbers in his code was 1 to 3. First letter he'd written to me, third word. Jason. Richard may have left me a final message after all. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. But I would need to wait to try and decipher the rest of it. Luckily, in a bout of sentimentality, I'd saved everything he'd written to me, but 3 of the letters were at my grandmother's house, and 2 of them were at my apartment in college mixed in with my school things. With helping Grandma get ready for Richard's funeral, I didn't have much time for decoding anyway. And just as well, I thought, as with only the first 3 keys available to me, I could only partially reveal his note. So I tried my best to forget about it for the time being. I would be heading back to school after we interred him. I could wait for a few days while we said farewell to Richard. I'm not sure why we bothered with all the fuss of holding a formal viewing and funeral services, though. Grandma and I were the only people in attendance. Seemed no one else deemed him worthy of their time. It was a strange sight, him lying in a casket. I hadn't seen him, other than in my grandma's photos, since they'd hauled him away following his sentencing. Back then, he still had life in his face. They'd done their best to pretty him up, but there wasn't much left of him to work with. The only remaining thing that allowed me to identify that it was even Richard was a small scar under his right eye from when he wrecked his bike once. Grandma stayed back when I approached him, not ready yet to say her goodbyes, but I was eager to put him behind me. And when I stood over his corpse, I expected my hatred to finally bubble over. But I just felt sadness, crushing sadness, thinking about who he could have become and how he ended up instead. It was tragic. I reached forward and touched his hand, and when I did, I felt something, like a stranger watching me from the shadows, a darkness lurking just out of the corner of my eye. Quickly, I pulled my fingers away, assuming my emotions had gotten the better of me in the moment. But a weight remained, oppressive, suffocating. I leaped a foot in the air when Grandma tapped me on the shoulder to ask if I was all right, and I snapped out of it. But the next few days, the feeling of someone standing right behind me persisted at all times. It made me twitchy, jumpy. Do you believe some kids really have imaginary friends? I know I didn't. Personally, I never had one as a kid, and if I'm being honest, I never knew anyone that did. My son Christian is 7, and since he was a toddler, he has always had a big imagination. From your typical Nerf battles to booking an entire pay-per-view for his wrestling action figures, Chris always found a way to keep himself entertained. He really is such a good kid. He always means well. Although Chris is a sweetheart, let's just say he is a little socially awkward. He struggled making friends. Even in preschool, he generally kept to himself. So you can imagine my excitement the one day he came home from school and said he made a new friend. I was so proud of him. This was a big step for the little guy. Even though he was only 7, I thought it was great that he finally was getting along with another kid. Ever since we moved, Chris had been struggling even more than normal. Maybe it was the new environment that he wasn't used to, or maybe it was the whole not fitting in thing. Hearing crying and sniffling in the middle of the night became the normal for a few weeks. It truly broke my heart. But hearing about this friend Chris made, maybe it would help him to get better. He really did deserve to be happy. We had downsized and moved to a smaller town because I lost my job. My wife Alyssa was now the sole breadwinner. While that was not ideal, the best I could do now was to be a good father and husband while I looked for a new job. The day Chris came home to tell me about his new friend, I was browsing the internet searching for a new job. It had been another unsuccessful search. Chris busted through the front door out of breath. "Daddy, I did it. I made a friend. His name is Richie. He is the coolest. He has this super awesome yo-yo that he showed me. Dad, I need it for Christianeas." I laughed and said, "All right, buddy, slow it down. It's only September. But tell me more about this new friend you made." "Dad, he is so funny. Everyone at school loves him. And I know you will too. Well, duty, he is gonna have to come by one day so we can all eat pizza and watch some wrestling." "Oh my gosh, that will be so awesome." Chris excitedly ran to his room, and I yelled down the hall, "Get started on your homework and let me know if you need any help." I haven't been this happy in weeks. As a dad and husband, you just want your family to be happy. After seeing the look on my son's face, I couldn't help but to smile from ear to ear. When my wife came home, I couldn't wait to tell her the news. I know it may not sound like the biggest deal to you, but that little boy is our world, and seeing him down in the dumps really crushed us. Alyssa was just as excited as I was that Chris seemed like he had finally settled in. She went to his room to hear the news straight from him. I was sitting there eavesdropping when I heard Alyssa yell out, "Babe," in a worried voice. I made my way towards Chris' room, and once I got through the door, my wife was pointing at Chris. With a smile on her face, she said, "Honey, who is this big boy, and what has he done with our little baby?" Chris chuckled and said, "It's still me, Ma. I just want to look cool like Richie." Chris was digging through his closet trying to find his favorite Ninja Turtle sweatshirt. That night before bed, my wife and I shared a look. We were happy. The first time we've been happy since we had to move. We shared a kiss and went to bed. For the next week or so, Chris would come home as happy as can be. He would tell me about what he was learning in school and how Richie was just the bestest friend. He would tell me about all the new toys Richie had and how he would let Chris play with them. I told Chris if they ever planned on hanging out outside of school, I would need to meet his parents. Chris said he knows that, but not to worry, because Richie told him his parents said they weren't allowed to hang outside of school. I thought that was strange, but just chalked it up to Richie's parents being strict. When I mentioned to Alyssa about Richie not being able to hang outside of school, she told me not to worry about it. She told me Chris was happy, we were happy, and things were finally going smooth. She was right. Chris was fitting in, and our home life as a family was great because of it. As the school year went on, I did notice something. It was pretty obvious because we were tight on cash. Due to the whole jobless thing. Chris would come home from school and almost weekly would have some sort of new toy he was playing with. A Hot Wheels car, Hess truck, airplane, wrestler, basketball. All things we didn't buy him. Whenever I asked him about it, he would always tell me the same thing. Richie let me borrow it. While I didn't think it was necessarily strange for kids to share toys, I did think it was strange that it was almost every week. Where is Richie getting these toys? It was a relatively small town, and to my knowledge it wasn't a particularly wealthy area, so I doubted someone could afford all these toys. When I brought up the toy situation with Alyssa, she did seem a bit concerned. She was wondering the same thing I was. Where were these toys coming from? Okay, this is gonna sound bad. Do you think Chris is taking these toys from the school or maybe even a student? Is Richie even real? As the words left my mouth, I realized it sounded much worse than what I had imagined. Chris was a bit of a different kid, sure, but he wasn't a liar. At least I didn't think so. Maybe I was jumping to conclusions. Take a look from my perspective, though. We are hearing all these amazing things about Richie. Chris has never once mentioned him coming over, sleeping over, or even going over to Richie's house. He didn't talk about any other friends or students. He came home with a different toy almost weekly and always had the same excuse as to how he got it. Alyssa looked at me with worried eyes. God, I hope not. Things were finally starting to look up. Well, I am going to ask him about it and see what he says. As I made my way down the stairs to Chris' room, I thought I heard something. It sounded like muffled talking coming from his room, but I couldn't quite make out what was being said. I stopped in my tracks and thought for a second. What if Chris was struggling so much to fit in he made Richie up? What if Richie is what Chris wants a friend to be? What if Richie is Chris' imaginary friend? My heart sank. I hoped that wasn't the case, but that would certainly explain some things. The lack of other friends, the fact that Chris never asked if Richie could come over, and now the talking. What if Chris was talking to his imaginary friend? What do I say? What do I do? Will this just be a phase? I didn't have the answers. Standing around in the hallway wasn't going to get me any either. I knocked on Chris' door and walked inside. Hey dude, how's school going? It's so good, Dad. Oh yeah, why's that? Let me guess, Richie. I said with a forced smile. Yeah, he is the best. He is always giving me stuff, like these toys. I wanted to ask you about that, Chris. Are you sure Richie is giving you these toys? Whatcha mean, Daddy? Are you taking them from the school, maybe? Another kid. You know, just borrowing them, of course. Chris sat there for a second and seemed to be thinking. No, Dad, Richie is giving me these toys. I told you that. What, did you forget or something? He started giggling. I smiled at him and thought about how happy he was. I gave him a big hug and left his room. I spent the whole night just thinking to myself, what am I gonna do about this? It had been a few days since my little talk with Chris. He hasn't mentioned Richie any more than usual, and he hasn't come home with any new toys. I had finally had luck with job searching. Funny enough, as I was scrolling through endless pages, I came across a job listing at Chris' school. It was for a janitor. I know it doesn't sound like the most glorious job, but I knew any amount of extra income would help. I applied and quickly received an email from the school to set up an interview for the next day. I knew Alyssa would be happy, and I figured Chris would be too. Even though I would be working, at least it was at his school where I could see him throughout the day. If I'm being honest, a little piece of me was eager to see if Richie was in fact a real kid and not some made-up imaginary friend. I waited on the front porch to meet Chris as he got off the bus. We lived close to the school, but just far enough away that he still required a bus. As Chris got off the bus, I can see he had his head down. I met him in the street and asked what was wrong. When he looked at me, I could tell he had been crying. He hadn't cried in weeks. It had me worried. Chris, what happened? Are you okay? No. Tell me what's wrong, kiddo. It's Richie, Dad. He is leaving. He said he was moving and today was his last day. He said as tears started to stream down his face. Oh man, I'm so sorry, buddy. Come here. I hugged him tight. I took his backpack off his shoulders and we continued towards the house. Chris didn't leave his room for the rest of the night. He didn't eat dinner. He just cried. When Alyssa came home, I broke the news to her. She was upset but had hopes that Chris would be able to make some new friends. Alyssa was in the shower when I decided I would go check on Chris and say goodnight. I made my way down the stairs towards his room. I stopped moving when I heard Chris talking. I couldn't quite make out what he was saying through the door, but as I got closer to his room, the words became more clear. "Come on, Richie, do you really have to go? We had so much fun. You are my best friend, and I really wish you could just stay with me." Before I knocked on the door, an odd feeling came over me. This all but proved that Richie wasn't real. Who could he be talking to? He didn't have a cell phone. Richie wasn't in the house. I proceeded to knock on his door and enter the room. There was Chris, sitting on his bed, walkie-talkie in hand. Not knowing what else to say, I asked him, "Who are you talking to?" "Richie, Daddy. I was telling him I don't want him to leave." "Richie gave that to you. Richie is real." "Richie is my friend, Dad." "Of course he is real." I took the walkie-talkie from his hand and pressed down the button. "Hello? Who's there? Is this Richie? Answer me." There was no answer. No noise from whoever had the other walkie-talkie. Silence. I proceeded to ask Chris about Richie. "Richie gave you this. Why? Does he live close by?" "I dunno. He gave it to me a while ago. We talk on it all the time." That must have what I heard the other night. Chris was talking to Richie, or whoever it was that had the other walkie-talkie. Richie must live close by. He has to be close to have a strong enough signal to talk to Chris. I took the walkie-talkie away from him. I kissed him on the head, told him I loved him, and that I would be taking him to school tomorrow. I didn't even get to tell him that I was going to hopefully be working at his school. The next morning I made some eggs for me and Chris. I asked how he was feeling, and he just shrugged. I assumed he was upset about Richie moving, and he was angry that I took the walkie-talkie away. Regardless, it was time to head to school. Once we parked, I grabbed Chris from the back seat. He looked at me strangely. "Dad, what you doing? You're supposed to drop me off." "I know, Bud, but today is different. I may get a job at your school. I'm here to talk to your principal. I may become your new janitor." Now I know. I was cut off by Chris' cries. He ran into the school with tears streaming down his face. Did he really not want me to work at the school? Was it embarrassing to have your dad here, or was it embarrassing that I may be a janitor? Either way, I hurried to the principal's office. I didn't want to be late for the interview. I walked into the office right on time and spoke to the secretary. "Hello, I'm here to see Mr. Golding. I have an interview today." "Ah, yes. You must be here for the janitor position that opened up. I'm really gonna miss the old one." She chuckled. I really never met a sweeter man. "Anyway, right this way. Mr. Golding is waiting for you inside." I walked into the office with my head held high. I needed this job, so I was there to impress. Mr. Golding was seated behind the desk, but stood up as I walked into. He reached out a hand, and I graciously accepted. "Hello, Mr. Golding. It's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to interview for this position." "Of course, Mr. Williams, thank you for coming for the interview so quickly. We need to fill the position ASAP. As you can guess, a school can get quite messy." I could only imagine. My son, Chris, is a second grader here, and he is always making some sort of mess. If I'm being honest, Mr. Williams, after looking over your resume, you are definitely more than qualified to work here. You seem like a man with a good head on his shoulders. You were punctual. And if I'm being honest, because Richard left us so suddenly, we are a bit desperate to fill this position. So if you would like it, the job is yours. A giant smile spread across my face. The tension instantly released from my shoulders. I finally got another job. I was beyond happy. I quickly accepted the job without hesitation. "Thank you so much, Mr. Golding. I promise you won't regret this. You don't understand how badly I needed this job." "Mr. Williams, welcome aboard. I have the master keys here in this drawer. Let me just grab them." Mr. Golding reached into his bottom drawer and pulled out a large set of keys. Every key is labeled. The janitor's equipment is in a supply container in the back of the school. Thank you for taking the job on short notice. I couldn't believe how fast of a process that was. I figured there was going to be at least one more interview. The fact that I could start right away was all the more reason to be excited. I looked at the keys in my hand while walking down the hallway and decided I wanted to check out how the previous janitor kept the equipment. As I approached the supply container, I froze in place. In my excitement of getting the job, I completely brushed past the fact the janitor's name was Richard. This couldn't be the Richie that Chris was talking about, could it? No, that didn't make any sense. It had to be a coincidence. Richard is a common name. Plus, this was a school. No way none of the teachers or students didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. As I inserted the key into the lock, my hands were shaking. I didn't do a very good job of convincing myself that a grown man did not befriend my son. I twisted the key and removed the lock. What I found inside activated a concoction of feelings in me I had never felt at the same time. Rage, anguish, hate, nervousness, sadness all in one. The walls were lined with children's movie posters. Action figures spread about the small coffee table inside. Nerf guns laid on a dusty old couch. That's when I saw it. King walkie-talkie. The same walkie-talkie that Chris had the night before. Whoever this sick bastard was talking to my King 7-year-old son. Tears started coming down my face like someone had turned on a faucet. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen in time. I started ripping the place apart. I don't know if it was out of anger or if I was looking for something specific. I did not care, I was just moving. Toys, snacks, candy. What the asterisk? The last drawer I opened, I truly wish I hadn't. I was staring down at pictures of my son. My son and this sick Richie, taking selfies together like it was some sort of prom picture. I had to leave. I ran to Chris' class, picked him up, and headed straight toward the exit. While holding my crying son, I began to break down. Chris whispered in my ear, "You'll never be as cool as Richie." I moved to a rural Australian town for the peace and quiet. I found anything but. I live in Smeaton, Australia, a small rural Victorian town you've probably never heard of. And I mean small. Population maybe 250 of that. Don't get me wrong, I like it that way. Peace and quiet. Well, that's why I moved here anyway. I'm not sure about that now. See, ever since I bought my home out here, I've been experiencing some strange happenings. My house sits near a small valley drop-off which leads down to a creek. I promise, that's relevant to the scene here. See, about a week after I moved in, I looked out the window to see a trail that was definitely not there before. It went straight up the valley, as if something had walked through there and stopped right at the top, right outside the fence line separating my house from the valley drop-off. Things didn't stop there. About a week later, I was up late at night, struggling to sleep. So I resigned to make myself a cuppa and watch some late-night movies. Sometime during the night, I heard the sound of leaves rustling outside, out the window where I noticed the trail the previous week. I took a bit of a sneaky peek out the window, and I saw someone running off down the drop-off. Worried that vandals or maybe burglars were targeting my home, it was at this point I decided to keep a diary, just in case I might need a document of events to give to law enforcement later on. I'll paste the diary below and let you be the judge. 3rd November. Happened again tonight. Almost asleep, and I hear those footsteps running up the valley. Still not sure why whoever it is keeps coming up from that way. I know there's a few local druggies that live across the creek. Maybe scoping my house. 12th November. They cut the fence this time. Woke up around 11 p.m. to an enormous racket. Turned on the spotlight out the side to see the fence was cut straight through. Must have used bolt cutters. Whoever this is seems organized. Unsure why they would cut the fence and just leave. Maybe a show of force. Had a bolt put on the gate. Might have been just trying to prove a point. No bolt's gonna stop them, yeah no. beginning to fear for my safety. 15th November. Woke up this morning to find my entire side fence line flattened, cut straight down on either side. No idea why anyone would do this. Have reported to local law enforcement. Investigations underway. 18th November. Local druggies down the creek have been arrested on charges of property damage. Hopefully this brings an end to these visits. 23rd November. Window was smashed in last night. How I didn't wake to the sound of it, I don't know. Side window, the one looking out over the drop-off, very clearly smashed inwards, and what looks like scratch marks around it on the outside. Have reported to police. December 1st. Whatever is happening, it's not the druggies. They haven't been back in town. This morning, woke to find footsteps in my yard. These are not normal. Too big. Have purchased a CCTV system. Hopefully get some real answers. December 5th. Have moved out of the house. Further incidents ensued, prompting me to check the security footage. Have not reported anything further to law enforcement. Too bizarre. On 2 occasions, shadows could be seen just beyond the tree line. On final night spent in house, I witnessed something reach out from those trees. A long, spindly arm, followed by a tall figure, dragging itself out of the trees, up the valley, and into my yard. From 11 p.m. until 4 a.m. it just stood there, looking into my window occasionally. It would walk around my yard, occasionally shuffling its way up the front stairs and peering in through the windows. At times, more of its kind would lumber out from the trees and join it. It seemed as though they were waiting for something. That's the end of my diary entries. Toward the end, it became very apparent to me that I was dealing with something not of this earth. The diary became less of a means to pursue any kind of legal action and more of a record of my final days should anything happen to me. No idea what exactly it was that I saw on those security recordings. It was clearly something we humans are not meant to witness. I know we've got some pretty frightening critters down here in the Down Under, supernatural or otherwise. And I'm sure I saw something that fits into the former category. Whatever it wasn't there to play. It was very clearly taunting me. And I've no doubt it would have done a lot more than that had I ever shown my face. As for why it never came into the house, I dunno. Maybe it did. There were those scratch marks up the wall the night my window was busted in. Maybe they were inside that night, and I never even knew it. I am a researcher of the Titanic. A recently discovered artifact has left me traumatized. I've spent my entire professional life studying the Titanic, but nothing could have prepared me for how deeply the ship would eventually consume me. My name is Dr. Michael Hartley, and I'm a maritime historian specializing in the RMS Titanic. For 20 years, I've dedicated my life to understanding every minute detail of that tragic voyage. The passengers, the crew, the intricate social dynamics, the fatal design flaws. What began as academic fascination gradually transformed into an obsession that would ultimately unravel my entire perception of reality. The artifact came from a private collection in Southampton. An elderly collector, Harold Jameson, had contacted me after hearing about my reputation. He claimed to have something unusual, personal effects recovered from the wreckage that had never been properly documented. Most researchers would have been skeptical, but my hunger for untold stories always outweighed my caution. When the package arrived, it was surprisingly modest. A small leather satchel, water-stained and fragile, contained what appeared to be personal documents, a tarnished locket, and a small fragment of fabric. The moment my fingers brushed against the items, something felt different. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. The fabric was what caught my attention first. A small, roughly triangular piece of third-class passenger clothing. Coarse, dark wool with intricate stitching. As I examined it under my magnifying glass, the edge unexpectedly caught my skin. The thin, precise cut opened across my palm, tiny droplets of blood immediately welling up. I should have cleaned the wound immediately. I should have been more careful. But something about the artifact held me transfixed. The blood seemed to, absorb into the fabric, not seep, not stain, but absorb like the material was drinking it. For a split second, I could have sworn the fabric's color deepened, becoming richer, more vibrant. That was the first moment I heard the whispers. Faint at first, so quiet I initially thought it was the wind or the ambient noise of my study. Fragmented words in a language that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. Desperate, terrified, no escape, water rising. God help me. I dismissed it as imagination, exhaustion from weeks of intense research. But as the days progressed, the whispers became more persistent, more defined. By the third night, I knew something fundamental had changed. The dreams began. Vivid, horrifyingly detailed nightmares that felt less like dreams and more like memories. I wasn't just observing, I was experiencing. I was Thomas Riley, a 22-year-old Irish immigrant from a small village outside Dublin, third-class passenger, dreaming of a better life in America, scraped together every penny for that ticket on the Titanic. In these dreams, these memories, I could feel the cramped conditions of steerage, the smell of unwashed bodies, the constant background noise of children crying, adults speaking in a dozen different languages, the hope, the desperation, and then the ice. The first impact was nothing like the dramatic Hollywood depictions, a subtle shudder. Most passengers didn't even realize something was wrong, but Thomas knew. Something in his bones understood the terrible mathematics of what was happening. Water, cold, rising. Panic would come later. First would be the terrible, suffocating realization of doom. Each night, the dreams grew more intense, more real. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my lungs burning, convinced I was drowning. My sheets would be damp, smelling of salt and industrial coal smoke. Something was happening to me. Something I couldn't explain. The cut on my hand didn't heal properly. What began as a simple wound transformed into something different. The skin around the cut remained perpetually raw, with an iridescent quality that shifted colors when caught in certain light. Blues and grays, like deep ocean water. Sometimes, if I stared too long, I could swear the wound moved. Not visibly, but with a subtle, internal rippling. My research became increasingly erratic. Colleagues noticed the change. Dr. Elizabeth Moreau, my longtime research partner, approached me during a conference, her concern etched deep in the lines of her face. "Michael, you look terrible," she said, not unkindly. "When was the last time you slept?" I couldn't tell her about the dreams, about Thomas, about the memories that weren't mine. The artifacts from the Southampton collection began to consume my every waking moment. I cataloged them obsessively, discovering minute details that had escaped previous researchers. A ticket stub with a partial fingerprint, a fragment of a letter, water damage, but still partially legible, a brass button from a third-class steward's uniform. Each item seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain. The whispers grew stronger. During the day, they were subtle, background noise that could be mistaken for the hum of fluorescent lights or the distant murmur of traffic. But at night, they became a symphony of terror. Hundreds of voices, overlapping, desperate. The water, can't breathe, too cold. I started keeping a journal, not for academic purposes, but as a desperate attempt to maintain my sanity, to track the progression of whatever was happening to me. Entry, October 17th. The dreams are becoming more specific. I'm not just experiencing Thomas's memories. I'm beginning to understand his entire life. His hopes, his fears, the smell of his mother's bread, the calluses on his hands from working the fields, the weight of his single best suit, purchased specifically for the journey to America. I know the exact moment he realized the ship was doomed. It wasn't a sudden revelation, not a dramatic moment of terror, just a slow, terrible understanding that crept into his consciousness like ice-cold water. The cut on my hand started to change. Small, intricate patterns began to emerge around the wound, patterns that looked like nautical maps, like the complex network of corridors inside the Titanic. Thin blue-gray lines that seemed to move when I wasn't directly looking at them. My sleep became a battlefield. One moment, I was Dr. Michael Hartley, respected historian, meticulous researcher. The next, I was Thomas Riley, poor, desperate, trapped. The boundary between us was dissolving, and something else was emerging, something that had been waiting, buried deep beneath the cold Atlantic waters for over a century, something that wanted to be remembered. By November, I was losing myself. My apartment became a sprawling archive of Titanic ephemera, walls covered in maritime maps, passenger lists, and photographs. But these weren't just historical documents anymore. They were alive. The photographs. God, the photographs. Third-class passengers frozen in sepia-tone moments would shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Faces would turn slightly. Eyes would follow me. Not all of them, just select images. Always the ones showing people who would die that night. Thomas's memories were no longer confined to dreams. I could taste the salt water during faculty meetings, feel the impossible cold of the Atlantic while lecturing about maritime engineering. Sometimes, mid-sentence, I would forget who I was. Was I the professor or the desperate young immigrant clutching a wooden panel in freezing water? The wound on my hand had become a map, literally. Intricate blue-gray lines now formed a precise topographical representation of the Titanic's lower decks. If I traced the lines with my finger, I could feel the ship's internal layout, could sense the exact location of each corridor, each compartment, the precise angles where water would first breach the hull. Dr. Moreau stopped calling. My department chair suggested a sabbatical. I was becoming something else, something between historian and haunting. One night, I discovered something in Thomas's memories that chilled me more than the phantom maritime cold that now perpetually surrounded me. He wasn't supposed to be on that ship. His original ticket, for a smaller vessel leaving a week earlier, had been lost. Stolen, actually, by a man whose name was never recorded in any manifest. A man whose face Thomas remembered with a strange, specific terror. A man who seemed to know what was coming. The whispers grew more insistent, no longer just memories of terror and drowning. Now they carried something else. A warning. He is coming. He has always been coming. Witnesses immediately noted irregularities within the carnival, including but not limited to unusual-looking workers, performing animals the likes of which no one in the town recognized, as well as what several survivors described as an astonishingly frightening freak show. Frightening or not, the carnival was a true novelty. Novelty attracts the curious, and the residents of Mauvav were no exception. The carnival opened at dusk. By all accounts, this small troupe offered the most incredible entertainment any of the revelers had ever experienced. The festivities were curtailed at moonrise, when a dark-haired man strode past the ticket booth against the protestations of the workers and marched onto the promenade. Witnesses initially assumed the man was part of the carnival because, like so many of the performers, he had an irregular appearance. Specifically, survivors described him as having a snake-like face, eyes that bled darkness, and skin tattooed with a strange, scale-like pattern. One survivor specifically described these tattoos as identical to the markings on a rattlesnake. Seemingly impervious to the commotion caused by his arrival, man opened his mouth and began to sing. Within moments, the earth began to tremble. The tremors erupted into waves. The ground itself rolled like the ocean, cresting and crashing, carrying tides of rocks and sandstone. Survivors all reported an unearthed obsidian sheet shattering, and the sheer beauty of the resultant splinters glinting under the moon. Revelers and performers alike began to scream, but those screams soon turned into laughter. Dancing followed, bodies whirling through the chaos, heedless as the ground opened up to swallow them, senseless to the rush of earth and the jutting rock plates that hit and crushed them. The newcomer continued to sing and the ground continued to break apart. Game booths fell apart, food stands descended into rifts in the ground. The big top crashed down and ignited, trapping howling animals, and screaming patrons alike in an inferno. Only when every part of the carnival had fallen, only when every light had died, only when darkness descended over everything, did the singer fall silent, and the earth still. 37 people died in the disaster. Another 15 vanished, including several young children. No bodies were ever recovered. All were presumed to have perished in the earthquake. I realized then that the haunting wasn't about the ship. It was about something much older, much darker, and I was just beginning to understand. Christmas came, and with it, a strange peace. The whispers didn't stop, but they changed. Thomas's memories became less a torment and more a companionship. I understood now that he wasn't trying to possess me. He was trying to warn me. Dr. Elizabeth Moraw visited me on Christmas Eve. I hadn't seen her in months, and the concern in her eyes told me I looked as fractured as I felt. "I brought you something," she said, placing an old leather-bound journal on my desk. It was my grandmother's. She was a maritime historian, too. I thought you might appreciate it. The journal belonged to a researcher from the 1930s, someone who had been investigating the Titanic long before modern technology made such research easier. As Elizabeth left, I opened the pages. Tucked between yellowed sheets was a photograph. Not of the Titanic, not of any passenger. A man, standing alone on a foggy pier, his face partially obscured, but familiar in a way that made the hair on my neck stand up. The man from Thomas's stolen memory. That night, the wound on my hand, now a living map of maritime tragedy, began to speak differently. No longer desperate whispers of drowning, but something more measured, more intentional. Some stories are meant to be remembered. Some warnings must be carried. I understood then that Thomas's spirit wasn't a victim. He was a guardian. The cold that had haunted me for months began to recede. Not completely, but enough that I could breathe. Enough that I could think clearly. Outside my window, snow fell, pure, silent. And for the first time since touching that artifact, I felt something like hope. The story wasn't over, but I was no longer afraid. At least, not completely. That asterisk, hi BAA. My new patient is a walking disaster. On August 4, 1907, a small traveling carnival passed through the railroad town of Moab, California. For reasons not fully determined, the singer's melody was adapted into a local folk song named King Mogav Green. Nearly 50 years later, the entity appeared in Tehachapi, California, shortly before the town's devastating earthquake on July 21, 1952. One elderly witness who happened to be present at the 1907 carnival disaster reported that he heard a man singing the eerie, unmistakable tune of King Mogav Green approximately 5 minutes before the quake struck. Several other witnesses observed the entity in the area approximately 10 to 45 minutes prior to the earthquake. While precise descriptions differed somewhat, all used variations of words such as reptilian, snake-like, demonic, and hypnotic. After the 1952 earthquake, the entity fully entered the annals of local folklore. Tales indicate that he is responsible for a number of ills, including floods, wildfires, devastating freezes, and man-made disasters related to the area's energy, mining, and manufacturing industries. Nevertheless, earthquakes are most closely associated with this entity by residents of the area. Due to obvious reasons, this entity was on the agency's radar following the 1907 disaster, but he successfully evaded detection for decades. After the 1952 earthquake, the agency redoubled its efforts and, for a time, even made the capture and containment of the entity its primary goal. The agency decided to call him King Mogav Green, after the song he sings before calamity strikes. Please note that to date, this inmate has not provided any staff with his name. When asked during the below interview, he stated that names are power, and you have enough of that. The agency's pursuit of King Mogav Green continued to be unsuccessful for nearly 2 years. The entity evaded numerous capture attempts by using his voice, which possesses two abilities: to induce severe psychological distress in human listeners, and, in the simplest terms imaginable, to cause natural disasters. The nature of his voice has naturally precluded intensive study, but AHA personnel theorize that the vibrations created from the pitch and tone are uniquely evolved to disrupt or even intentionally manipulate organic matter on a molecular level. The inmate's voice does not have to be heard to be effective. In one of the few experiments conducted by agency personnel, his singing induced similar levels of distress in both subjects who could hear him and those who could not. Given the consistent reports of his reptilian appearance, the agency theorized that Cain Mauve Green went dormant in winter like many species of snakes and lizards native to the area. This theory proved correct. The entity was located in a large burrow in the Tehachapi Mountains on January 2, 1955, in a state of hibernation. The weakness and lethargy associated with hibernation allowed personnel to take him into custody. Cain Mauve Green presents as a dark-haired adult male of indeterminate age. Although contradictory, his eyes are perhaps best described as luminous black. He has an underdeveloped nose, no visible outer ear structures, and a wide mouth. His most distinctive feature is his skin, which is covered in scales identical in size, texture, color, and pattern to that of the Mauve green rattlesnake. Due to continual and destructive refusal to cooperate with the agency, Cain Mauve Green is not permitted to speak. He wears a custom-designed internal muzzle that immobilizes his tongue, jaws, and palate, and extends down his throat to block all but the most rudimentary of sounds, such as grunts and moans. His cell is temperature-controlled and must never exceed 42 degrees Fahrenheit in order to maintain a state of critical lethargy. As an additional precaution, staff administer daily injections of a neuromuscular blocking agent to paralyze his vocal cords in the event he wakes up unexpectedly. Administration has attempted to surgically remove the inmate's vocal cords on several occasions, but the inmate is capable of regrowing both internal and external structures following injury. After the fourth regrowth of the removed parts, decided to refrain from further removal efforts. After in-depth discussion among command staff and administration, some of these measures were temporarily mitigated on December 6, 2024 to facilitate a meeting with the agency's new interviewer. The agency provided the inmate with a specialized voice prosthesis to ensure a productive conversation. The interviewer would like to note that the information relayed in the inmate's interview matches a local myth involving a cataclysmic flood. The main difference between the inmate's account and human retellings is, of course, perspective. Specifically, the human myth casts this inmate in the role of destroyer. Based on the information received, it is the interviewer's opinion that administration should strongly consider the possibility that this was never true, and that release of the inmate would serve the agency's goals more effectively than incarceration. When I was young and whole, I was one of many, and we fought a common enemy. You once understood this. We lived under the earth, in beautiful cities and fields of clouds. We only surfaced for two reasons only: to fight for you, and to bring our fallen to the dark pool that they might truly rest. We did not fight for you freely. We were hungry. Although we were hungry, we were always fair. You were not. Over time, you forgot that you fed us so that we might fight the destroyers. You forgot that we gave everything to do this, that we rallied the earth itself to protect you from that which has no place here. You forgot that we were your guardians, and so you became our destroyers. You hated our war songs and cut out our tongues when you caught us. How did you forget why we sang those songs at all? I never understood how you could forget. We were far stronger than you, but you outnumbered us on an incomprehensible scale. Our small victories, for our victories were always small, only brought greater losses later. If we struck once, even in defense, you struck back 20 times and then laughed. You laughed when you took my brother. You cut him open and tore him apart to kill him, but he did not die. We do not die until we are washed in the pool. You forgot that too. Because you forgot, you could not understand why he did not die. At first, this made you afraid. Then it made you angry. Then it made you amused. You kept his body to desecrate. You peeled his flesh and made me wear it. You shaved his head. You plucked out his eyes. You cut his nose and hands away. The sounds my brother made still echo in my heart. They are part of the song I sing to the earth, even now. His destruction became my strength. This would make him proud. It would make me proud were our roles reversed. Though he could not die, he began to rot. Eventually, the smell accomplished what nothing else could, and you destroyers dragged him from their camp. He wept as his fleshless back dragged and tore along the rocky dirt. I did not know that you could weep without eyes, but he did. I watched him cook under the sun. I saw fat red ants glittering as they swarmed him. I saw the flies crawl into his eye sockets. I saw their maggots squirming like pearls made flesh. I watched the birds descend to pluck his sinews. One had the face of a man and smiled at me as I wept. When my brother and all the rest were too defeated to offer any further amusement, the fight and its fighters moved on, leaving destruction without even the mercy of death. Of my people, I alone remained whole. I alone carried their bodies to the pool. I alone washed them clean, purifying them of pain and the touch of the destroyers. I alone sang our death song. I could not form the words, for they had taken my tongue too. But I sang the melody and prayed it would be enough. I washed my brother last. As I pushed him off into the still black water, he smiled. I wept. As I wept, the world shifted and changed. I felt currents in the air, dancing and crackling across my skin like sparks in a night fire. I felt fear, even terror, and the certainty that danger was near at hand. I looked up, wishing for the strength to fight this new danger, but knowing it would not come. What I saw frightened me. Overhead, the night sky danced with rivers of light, something I had never seen. Before me, the black pool was perfectly still and filled with stars. The pool did not reflect stars. It reflected nothing, not even the lights in the sky. The stars I saw were within the water, or perhaps in place of the water. The brightest star hung in the center, burning bright as a sun the color of bone. I watched, terrified and mesmerized, understanding somehow that this star was the source of the vast menace I tasted in the air. This star vanished before my eyes, extinguishing like a flame, only to reappear a moment later. And then it began to grow. It expanded through the pool, swallowing the other stars. Terror as I have never known, terror and horror, consumed me in the same way the light consumed the stars and the warm darkness surrounding them. When the light reached the shores of the pool, it seethed, shifting and rising. Then it vanished for a moment, only to explode back into being. I realized then what this thing was. An eye. A monstrous, white-hot eye, like a blinding moon. Horror flooded me once more, and a sense of terrible wrongness, of something worse than death, worse even my brother's undeath, preparing to rise from that void of corrupted light. I knew, also, that it meant to consume my brother. I did not think. I acted. I reached into the pool for my brother. My arms plunged into something soft and wet, like overripe fruit. I did not hear a scream, but I felt the thing in the pool scream. The pain, the rage reverberating through my very bones as bright, blinding ichor exploded around me. I felt another scream as it retreated, recoiling from my touch. Unencumbered, my hands quickly found my brother, and I dragged him out. The eye sent bleeding, writhing tendrils to stop me, soft, rotten flesh binding my wrists, but they were too weak to stop me. My brother grieved to be pulled from the water. His smile was gone, and he wept again. His weeping broke my heart. It was wrong to take him from the pool. But what was I to do? It was no longer a pool, no place of rest or peace, only a place of unfathomable destruction. As I begged my brother for forgiveness, the pool that was no longer a pool blinked again, then shuddered. And then it became a blinding geyser of light, whipping and writhing under the undulating sky. It crashed over me like a wave, but unlike a wave it forced itself inside me, through my nose, my mouth, my ears. It burned like fire and moved like a predator, burying itself in my insides as though it had hooks. I felt a terrible pressure in my head and an even more terrible agony as blood poured from my ears. The earth swayed under my feet, and I fell. When I fell, the tendrils pulled, dragging me into the pool from within my mouth and ears. It was so bright, brighter than the sun, but the color of the moon. Nothing but light, within and without. Light and agony. I am not of light. I am of the earth. I come from under the ground, first from burrowed cities long dead, and now only burrows filled with roots and rabbits and worms. Darkness is and will always be my home. I refuse to die drowned in light. And so I fought. I pulled the tendrils out of me, screaming as the barbs tore through my insides, and then I swam for shore, a speck of darkness in a radiant sea. I reached the shore gasping and bleeding, choking on the writhing remnants inside me. I pulled thin, slithering, radiant worms from between my teeth and spat mouthfuls of blood infected with grains of squirming light. As I pulled its remains out of me, the pool that was no longer a pool shuddered and receded, drawing up into a wall of light on the opposite shore, and then it erupted once more, shattering to reveal a corrupted thing with a broken face and great white eyes that burned holes in the night, so bright they burned holes in the light itself. In itself. I screamed, and the world itself shattered just as the light had. The ground rose and broke like waves, crashing into itself before splitting apart. Darkness poured out. Warm, living darkness that swept across me like a blanket and swallowed the light. Night birds screamed and took flight. Elk bellowed, racing across the surging earth. Big cats tore over cresting tides of dirt and rock. The pool that was no longer a pool overflowed, breaking its banks as the moon-eyed enemy billowed upward, great claws reaching for me. I screamed again. The shores of the pool shuddered once more and slid upward, vast torrents of earth thrusting upward to form hills. These walls of earth smashed against each other, burying the pool and crushing the enemy between them. The moon-eyed abomination snarled, spitting flecks and foam of burning light that scorched my skin. Then it smiled, and its teeth were even brighter than its eyes. It dug its claws into the broken earth and squirmed upward, outward. The rocky outcroppings and jagged ground of the risen shores sliced its flesh as it fought its way free. Light bled from the wounds, burning the darkness into nothing. As its body slithered up from the earthen trap, it unfurled great wings made of fire and stars, and the rivers of light rippling in the sky. Once more, I screamed. The earth under the pool broke open with a dreadful roar. The surrounding hills crumbled, tumbling down upon us. Boulders smashed the enemy's head and tore holes in its wings through which darkness poured triumphantly and spread. Earth and rocks, trees and roots, cascading down in a wall of warm and living dark. By the end, the earth covered the enemy's body like a cairn, except for its bloody, broken claws, which lay extended and gleaming upon what remained of the rocky shore. By daybreak, even the claws lost their light. That was only the first. There are countless more. I have killed many, in all their forms, and blocked the way of many more than that. They come in great bursts of light and destruction. Earth and darkness keep them at bay. I am the servant of earth, born from living darkness. I was a guardian of your land and your own people. You once understood this, but you have already forgotten it far longer than you ever knew it. That is why you hunted us, why you destroyed as many of your guardians as you could, and betrayed the rest. Do you know what horrors have crept through the crevices in my lands since you locked me away? Do you care? Do you know how many more horrors have crept into the world since you began to kill and entrap us? Do you understand that you are betraying yourselves as well as your guardians? Do you know what will happen to you once you have destroyed and betrayed us all? I do not know. I am asking if you know. If you do not know, then perhaps it is time you stop. It's been so long since I was warm. Let me touch your hands, please, so I can remember how it is to be warm. Thank you. I'm an urban explorer who visited a remote Alaskan island in the Bering Sea. King Island loomed out of the mist like a ghostly lookout in the middle of the Bering Sea. The island, barely a mile wide and a mile long, was a rugged outcrop of steep slopes and jagged cliffs. Perched precariously on these cliffs was a village of stilted huts, abandoned for over 50 years. The village, once home to the Asuluk, people of the sea, now stood as a skeletal remnant of a long-gone era, its structures creaking in the wind, and its pathways overgrown with a tangle of hardy vegetation. The absolute isolation of King Island was precisely what had drawn Michael Pay, a seasoned urban explorer and popular YouTuber, to its shores. Michael had built a substantial following by documenting the forgotten corners of the world, places where history and decay intertwined to tell silent, haunting stories. King Island, with its unique history and haunting desolation, was a perfect addition to his channel. It was strictly against the rules, but he was determined to stay overnight, capturing footage that would mesmerize his audience and cement his reputation as a fearless explorer. As the daily tourist boat approached the island, Michael stood at the bow, his camera already recording the approach. The tourists around him chattered excitedly, their voices a stark contrast to the overwhelming silence of the island. The guide's voice echoed through a megaphone, recounting the history of the Asuluk and the village's abandonment. But Michael barely listened. He had done his research into this place, and his mind was already focused on the night ahead. The boat docked at a small rickety pier, and the tourists disembarked, their cameras clicking as they took in the haunting scenery. Michael hung back, though, his heart pounding with feelings of excitement and trepidation. He watched as the tourists were shepherded around by the guide, their visit limited to a relatively few safe spots. When the time came for the group to return to the boat, Michael discreetly slipped away, hiding behind one of the stilted huts until the sound of the boat's engine faded into the distance. Now, alone on King Island, Michael felt an uncomfortable chill, one that had nothing to do with the temperature. The island seemed to breathe around him, its silence suddenly profound, and yet also suffocating. He glanced at his watch. It was just past noon. He had several hours of daylight left to explore and document the village before nightfall. Slinging his backpack over his shoulder, he set off up the steep slope, his camera capturing every creak of wood and rustle of wind-blown grass. For Michael, the true adventure had now begun, and he had no idea of the terror that awaited him in the darkness. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. As dusk settled over King Island, the final rays of sunlight painted the abandoned village in hues of deep orange and shadowy blue. Michael had spent the afternoon methodically exploring and recording the empty huts and narrow pathways. Now, with the boat back to the mainland long departed, he was truly alone. He chose a relatively intact hut perched on a steep slope for his base camp, its weathered wood and rusted nails offering a semblance of shelter against the encroaching night. He set up his gear meticulously, arranging his camera equipment to capture a 360-degree view of the hut's interior. As the darkness deepened, Michael turned on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the thickening gloom. He spoke into his camera, narrating his thoughts and observations about the ghostly silence and the desolate beauty of the place. His voice sounded unnaturally loud against the backdrop of the island's quiet. With the camera running, Michael ventured outside to continue his exploration under the cover of night. The village felt different in the dark. It was more sinister, as if the shadows themselves were alive. As he walked, he noticed the wind had picked up, creating an eerie symphony as it whistled through the stilts and cracked wooden beams. Then came the first noise, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of footsteps on the wooden planks. Michael froze, his flashlight beam darting toward the source of the noise. He saw nothing but the empty village, the wind-swept paths, and the ghostly silhouettes of the huts. He shook his head, convincing himself it was just the wind playing tricks on his mind. Continuing his exploration, Michael reached a clearing that overlooked the sea. The moon hung low and heavy, casting a silver glow over the water. He paused to capture the scene, marveling at the haunting beauty of the island at night when he heard it again. This time, louder and closer. It was unmistakably the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. Michael swung around, his flashlight flickering as if the batteries were dying. The beam fell on a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the light. His heart pounded as he squinted, trying to make out the features of the figure. But in the blink of an eye, it was gone, leaving only the swaying grass and the echo of his racing heartbeat. Returning to the hut, Michael felt the first pangs of true fear. He reviewed his footage, hoping to find a rational explanation, but the camera showed only what he had seen. An empty village, a desolate clearing, and a fleeting shadow. The hut's creaking grew louder, more persistent, like the steady drip of water from a faucet, and Michael could no longer ignore the growing sense of dread. As he settled into his sleeping bag, the wind outside seemed to carry whispers, faint and unintelligible. The hut groaned and creaked around him, each noise amplified in the silence. He tried to rationalize it as the natural sounds of an old structure, but deep down, he knew something was very wrong. The island was not as abandoned as it seemed, and the spirits of the ancient people, restless and angry, were making their presence known. Sleep was elusive as Michael lay there, eyes wide open, every muscle in his body tense. He realized that he was not alone on King Island, and whatever was out there in the dark was watching and waiting. The first signs of haunting had made themselves known, and his stay on this desolate island was far from over. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Dawn eventually arrived on King Island, but the sunlight did little to dispel the lingering sense of unease. Michael awoke from a restless sleep, his mind still haunted by the inexplicable sounds and shadows of the night before. Determined to uncover the island's secrets, he packed his gear and set out to explore more of the village in the stark light of day. As he navigated the narrow, overgrown paths, Michael stumbled upon an old communal area, the remains of a large fire pit, surrounded by weathered totems and carvings, hinted at the rich cultural civilization that once thrived here. Intricate markings, some almost faded beyond recognition, decorated the totems, telling stories that Michael could only guess at. He documented everything with meticulous care, feeling a strange mix of excitement and dread. In one of the huts, Michael discovered a small, ornately carved box. Inside, he found a collection of artifacts, stone tools, bone carvings, and what appeared to be a ceremonial mask. As he lifted the mask, a sudden chill swept through the room, and he felt as though unseen eyes were watching his every move. He quickly replaced the mask and closed the box, but the feeling of being observed lingered. The day passed in a blur of discoveries and mounting tension. The more Michael uncovered, the more the island seemed to respond. Objects began to move on their own, a stone rolling across the floor, a door creaking open without a breeze to move it. Whispers filled the air, barely audible, elusive and just beyond the range of comprehension. At times, he swore he caught glimpses of figures out of the corner of his eye, but they vanished the moment he turned to look. As evening approached, Michael retreated to the hut to review his footage and conduct some research on the Asuluk tribe. Using a satellite internet connection, he delved into historical records and anthropological studies. He learned that the Asuluk had lived on King Island for generations, thriving in their unique and challenging environment. However, the records grew vague and unsettling when describing the tribe's sudden departure. According to local folklore and a number of academic sources, the Asuluk had been driven away by the spirits of an even older civilization. These ancient spirits, it was said, were powerful and hostile, angry at the intrusion of the living on their sacred land. The tribe's shaman had reportedly tried to appease the spirits with rituals and offerings, but in the end, the Asuluk had no choice but to abandon the island, leaving their homes and possessions behind. This realization hit Michael hard. The spirits he had sensed were not just figments of his imagination or mere remnants of the past. They were real and dangerously active. As the sun again dipped below the horizon, plunging the island into darkness once more, the paranormal activity escalated to a terrifying level. The whispers grew louder and more coherent, forming disjointed phrases in a language Michael could not understand. Shadows flitted across the walls, sometimes taking on humanoid shapes that seemed to reach out to him. Objects flew across the room with violent force, and the temperature plummeted, making his breath visible in the frigid air. Michael's camera, which he had left running in the corner of the hut, captured everything. The whispers, the shadows, even the flying objects. He knew he had irrefutable evidence of the haunting, evidence that could propel his YouTube fame to new heights, but the triumph of that realization was overshadowed by sheer terror. He was no longer just an observer, now he was a target. Frantically, Michael searched through his notes and footage, hoping to find some clue that might help him survive the night. He realized that the spirits were growing increasingly aggressive, perhaps sensing his fear or maybe just angered by his intrusion into their domain. The tales of the Asuluk shaman came back to him, and he wondered if there was any way to replicate their rituals, to somehow appease the spirits long enough for him to escape. Outside, the wind howled, and the hut's aging structure groaned under the pressure of the unseen forces. Michael knew he was running out of time. With trembling hands, he began to set up a makeshift altar using the artifacts he had found, hoping against hope that he could survive until the boat returned the next day. His second night here was far from over, and the spirits of Cane Island were closing in. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The midnight air on Cane Island was thick with an unnatural chill, and it felt as if the island itself had been plunged into an abyss of despair. Michael's makeshift altar stood in the center of the hut, the artifacts arranged with a desperate hope that they might placate the vengeful spirits. But as he knelt before it, clutching the ceremonial mask, the atmosphere inside the hut grew increasingly oppressive. Without warning, a deafening crash reverberated through the hut. The walls shuddered as unseen malevolent forces battered them from all sides. Michael scrambled to his feet, heart pounding, as a ghostly figure materialized in front of him. It was a translucent vision of an ancient shaman, eyes burning with an ethereal fire. The spirit's mouth moved, emitting a guttural chant that resonated deep within Michael's bones. Before he could react, the shaman raised a spectral hand, and Michael was thrown backward by an invisible force. He crashed into the far wall, pain radiating throughout his body. The mask slipped from his grasp, skidding across the floor. Struggling to breathe, he watched in horror as the room filled with more ghostly apparitions. Men, women, and children of the ancient tribe, their faces contorted with anger and sorrow. The spirits moved with purpose, their collective rage directed at Michael. Objects in the hut levitated and hurtled towards him, barely missing their mark. He ducked and dodged, each near miss intensifying his fear. His initial curiosity about the haunting had morphed into sheer terror. The realization that he was no longer an observer, but a target, fully sank in. Desperation clawed at his mind as he tried to formulate an escape plan. He grabbed his flashlight and darted out of the hut, the beams of light flickering erratically. The village outside was a maze of shifting shadows and supernatural, glowing figures. Every direction seemed fraught with danger, but he knew he couldn't possibly stay in the hut. His thoughts raced as he considered his options. The boat would return at dawn, but that was hours away. He was trapped on the island with no immediate means of escape. The only chance he had was to survive until daylight. He remembered the old fire pit and the communal area he'd found earlier. Perhaps he could use the open space to his advantage, keeping the spirits at bay long enough to endure the night. As he ran through the village, the spirits pursued him relentlessly. Their whispers grew into a cacophony of wails and chants, their forms flickering in and out of existence. One spirit, more corporeal than the others, reached out and clawed at his arm. Pain shot through him as if he had been burned. He stumbled but forced himself to keep moving, adrenaline surging through his veins. Finally, he reached the clearing with the fire pit. He dropped to his knees, and hastily gathered kindling and wood, praying that a fire might provide some kind of protection. His hands trembled as he struck a match, the tiny flame offering a glimmer of hope. After a short while he managed to get a small fire going, the flickering flames illuminating the clearing. For a moment, the spirits seemed to hesitate, their forms wavering at the edge of the firelight. Michael took the opportunity to catch his breath, taking stock of the reality of his situation. He was alone, outmatched, and surrounded by hostile forces he barely understood. The curiosity that had driven him to explore King Island now felt like a cruel joke, replaced by a primal fear for his life. The spirits quickly regrouped, their resolve unbroken. They began to circle the fire, their chants growing louder, more insistent. Michael knew the fire wouldn't hold them off forever. As he stared into the flames, he recalled the rituals and offerings mentioned in his research. He needed to perform some form of appeasement, but he had no idea how or if it would even work. With no other options, he grabbed the ceremonial mask from his backpack and placed it on his face, hoping it would grant him some connection to the spirits. He mimicked the shaman's chants he had heard earlier, his voice trembling. The spirits paused, their eyes fixed on him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. For a brief, hopeful moment, the island seemed to hold its breath. But then the shaman's spirit stepped forward, raising its hand once more. The fire blazed higher, and the ground beneath Michael's feet began to shake. He realized with dawning horror that his attempt at appeasement had only enraged them further. As the spirits closed in, Michael's fear reached its peak. He was out of time and options, facing the full wrath of the island's ancient inhabitants. His only hope now was to somehow endure the night and pray for dawn's arrival, when the boat would return and offer a chance at escape. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The second night on King Island had turned into an unrelenting nightmare. Michael clung to the hope that he could survive until dawn, but the spirits showed no signs of abating. As he huddled by the fire, the shaman's spirit slowly advanced, its spectral form pulsing with a malevolent energy. The other spirits closed in as well, their chants reaching a fever pitch. Michael's mind raced as he tried to think of a strategy. His urban exploration skills had taught him to navigate any number of dangerous, unstable environments, and he knew he had to use those skills now. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the fight of his life. Grabbing his flashlight and camera, he made a sudden dash away from the fire, heading towards the cliffs on the far side of the village. The spirits followed, their wrath tangible in the air. The ground beneath Michael's feet seemed to tremble with each step, and the whispers and wails of the spirits filled his ears, almost drowning out his own thoughts. He navigated the narrow paths and unstable ground with precision, avoiding pitfalls and crumbling structures. His flashlight beam bounced erratically, casting grotesque shadows that danced and swirled around him. As he climbed higher, the wind picked up, howling through the cliffs and adding to the cacophony of noise. Michael's breath came in ragged gasps, his muscles burning with exertion. He knew he couldn't keep this pace up for long, but stopping was not an option. He glanced at his watch. Dawn was still hours away, and he needed to buy himself more time. Reaching a high vantage point, Michael paused to catch his breath and reassess his situation. Below, the spirits swarmed the village, their glowing forms like a sea of angry fireflies. He could see the faint outline of the shore in the distance, where the boat would arrive with the first light of day. It was his only chance, but the path down was treacherous and filled with the restless dead. Suddenly, a shaman's spirit appeared in front of him, its eyes burning with an intense, otherworldly light. Michael stumbled back, nearly losing his footing. The spirit raised its arms, and the air around Michael grew thick and oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was trying to crush him. Gasping for breath, he realized he had to confront the shaman if he hoped to make it to the shore. Drawing on every ounce of courage, Michael stood his ground. He remembered the chants he had mimicked earlier and began to repeat them, his voice trembling but growing steadier with each word. The shaman's spirit hesitated, its form flickering. Encouraged, Michael continued, his voice rising above the howling wind and the spirit's wails. The shaman let out an unearthly scream, and Michael felt a force slam into him, knocking him to the ground. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself to get up. He couldn't give in now. With a final, desperate push, he shouted the last lines of the chant, his voice breaking the spectral tension around him. For a moment, everything went still. The spirits paused, their forms wavering. The shaman's eyes locked onto Michael's, and he felt a strange connection, as if the spirit was seeing him, truly seeing him, for the first time. Then, with a burst of light, the shaman vanished, and the other spirits began to fade, their energy dissipating into the night. But the danger wasn't over, and Michael knew the spirits could return at any moment. He seized the opportunity and began his descent towards the shore. The path was steep and slippery, and he had to use every bit of his agility and knowledge to avoid falling. The first hints of dawn were beginning to color the sky, casting a pale light over the island. As he neared the bottom, the spirits reappeared, more aggressive than ever. They surged towards him, their forms coalescing into a wall of spectral rage. Michael pushed himself harder, his legs burning with exhaustion, his mind a blur of fear and determination. The sound of the boat's horn in the distance spurred him on. Finally, he burst through the last of the undergrowth, the rocky shore now within running distance. The boat was approaching, its lights cutting through the early morning mist. Michael waved frantically, his voice hoarse as he shouted for help. The spirits were closing in, their whispers now a deafening roar in his ears. He knew he had survived a night of unimaginable horror, but the experience had left its mark. The footage he had captured would prove the existence of the supernatural, but at a cost he had never anticipated. The island's secrets had nearly claimed his life, and if he was to successfully escape, he knew their whispers would haunt him forever. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. As the first light of dawn finally pierced through the dense fog, Michael reached the shore, his body bruised and battered, his spirit frayed by the night's harrowing ordeal. The sounds of the spirits' whispers were now a deafening roar behind him, urging him to run faster, to escape their wrath. He stumbled over the rocky terrain, each step fueled by sheer desperation. Just as he feared the spirits would catch him, the tourist boat's horn blared in the distance. The vessel's lights cut through the mist, a beacon of salvation. Michael waved his arms frantically, his shouts for help merging with the cries of the spirits. The crew on the boat spotted him, and the boat made a swift turn towards the shore. Fear gnawed at him day and night, his once passionate pursuit of urban exploration, now tainted by the specter of the supernatural. He hesitated to release the footage on YouTube, unsure of the consequences it might bring. Would sharing the proof of the spirit's existence invite more torment, more relentless haunting? In a moment of desperate clarity, Michael decided. He deleted the footage, erasing all the evidence of his ordeal on Cane Island. It was perhaps a futile attempt to appease the spirits, to erase any trace of their presence from his life. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be enough. The spirits had marked him, and they would not rest until they had exacted their toll. As he sat alone in his darkened apartment, haunted by the memories of Cane Island and the unseen forces that now surrounded him, Michael realized the true twist of his story. The spirits had won. They had not only driven him to the edge of terror, but had followed him back to ensure he would never forget the price of trespassing into their realm. And so, Michael Pay, once a fearless explorer of abandoned places, slowly became a prisoner of his own fear, forever haunted by the spirits of Cane Island and the chilling truth that some ghosts never truly leave the places they haunt, while others never leave those that trespass their home. Cal's Cosmic Video, The Neon God. I went into work the next day only thinking that I was so ready to clock out, I would fake dying if need be. It was a Saturday night. There was a party going on at Sarah Carson's house, and I didn't want to be here, damn it. Not like I had heard anything from Dustin yet, either. There was no telling what I was walking into, with nobody else set to close with me. Things only got more complicated when I walked in at 2 that afternoon. Why Cal didn't give us a heads up when new stuff was coming in, I have no idea. But lo and behold, I walked through the front door that afternoon and sitting by the back wall, now squeezed in tight between the doorway to the adults-only room and the Sega games, were 2 arcade cabinets. The first one I can't really say was a bad idea. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is still a safe bet, even 30 years later. Turns out, Cal saw how important fighting games were getting and decided getting a cabinet for tournaments was a way to make some really good money during the slower months. Man was ** king right, too, because that MVC2 game made more than I ever did at that job. The second cabinet, though, it was different. The art was surreal, like Dolly took way too much acid and had the worst trip ever. The way it was installed made it hard to see, though, with one side blocked by MVC2, but the other side had this huge face painted over it, except excruciatingly detailed. It reminded me of one of those cutaway gags from the Nickelodeon cartoons, where they would suddenly make Ren or Stimpy hyper-realistic. The face was screaming in a mix of rage and agony, sharp teeth inside dripping with neon blue. The eyes were closed, but every pore on the green skin was insanely clear, almost thousands of them. Each a detail eye right down to the irises and pupils, with some of the most attention I've ever seen put to art. The setup by comparison was simple, just 2 bright blue light guns and a big screen. Over the top, the name of the game was visible in bright green and red colors, Neon God. I didn't have much time to check things out before I had to clock in, but I did stop for a second to check it out closer. The title screen was flashing, showing a massive neon blue and red giant in the middle of a huge pit, darkness engulfing it. Chains trailed from around the wrists, ankles, and neck of the thing, anchoring it to the sides of the pit. A text on the screen read, "Can you free the Neon God?" It was some of the cleanest graphics I had seen at that time in my life, too. Way above the 32-bit stuff that was getting big right around then. The Neon God was just sleeping, chained to the pit around it as the camera revolved, revealing runes carved in red and green on his skin. Even on the pixelated LCD display of the cabinet, I could make out the shapes almost without effort, though there wasn't much detail on anything other than the god. Work went by mostly without incident that afternoon. It was pretty quiet, and I mostly just worked on returns. Had the misfortune of finding another homemade porno, this time recorded over a copy of the Power Rangers movie. The Megazord battle was just getting to the good part when it cut in too. A few people came in throughout the day to play the new games, but most of them just stuck to MVC2. Neon God sat there, the same title screen constantly on loop. After a few hours, I noticed that there were slight changes to it, though. The Neon God was no longer sleeping, now raging against the chains that held him, furiously roaring through the low volume on the cabinet. The runes on its skin were brighter as it became more angry, desperately trying to break the chains that bound it. Despite all it gave, though, the chains wouldn't break, only rattling. I shrugged it off as part of the title sequence I had missed earlier, just not noticing since I didn't look at the right time. But the more I watched, the more I noticed. The movements of the god didn't repeat like other game title screens. Everything seemed fluid, not like any per-render. And if it was a per-render, it was putting this machine to work with how long it was. Before I realized it, 30 minutes had passed, and it never fell back into the slumber I first saw it in. It wasn't until after the sun was down that someone decided to play it. This guy named Dante, quiet dude, kept to himself, always rented JRPGs on the first day they released, to the point where he asked us to special order some a few times. He brought a copy of Phantasy Star up to the counter and started talking to me around 7. I get the Marvel, but what the hell is that other game? I haven't seen it in any arcades. He mentioned, pulling out his wallet. Not sure, it just got put in this morning. I haven't even had a chance to play either of them yet. I mumbled, scanning the game box and putting his info into our crappy computer system. How long this one going to take you? He laughed, but I was serious. This man rented Grandia around the time it released and only took 3 days to go through and complete everything. Side quests, hidden bosses, all of it. An absolute menace when it comes to JRPGs. Eventually, I guess he realized I was serious, because his look changed. Just the 5-day rental is fine, the usual. Yeah, but I don't want to charge you for 5 days, then find it in the return basket tomorrow. Plus, these older Genesis RPGs are way shorter than the ones coming out on PlayStation. You're in here all the time as is. Don't pay Cal extra. I said, hand-waving him. I'm putting you down for 5 on the return book, but charging you for an overnight. Plus, it's an old game, so that's gonna be $1.50, please. Dude, it's fine. I don't want you getting in trouble with Calendar. I'm going to take my time with this one. Plus, I only brought a 5 and don't have any change, he said, holding up the bill and his Cal's cosmically loyal customer card, which I threw 2 punches on before changing out his 5. Look, I can't say I was concerned with being a model employee at this point, especially considering the events of the past few weeks, so forgive me for a little business sabotage. Thanks, man. I really appreciate it. Dan stuttered, taking back the change and card before stuffing them back in his beaten wallet. So you haven't had a chance to play that one yet, right? The graphics look pretty crazy. Like the FMV stuff they've had on the Saturn almost. Yeah, it looks wild. I'm not really good at the light gun stuff though. Jurassic Park and Time Crisis always kicked my ass, I mentioned, leaning over the counter to look at the game cabinet a few dozen feet away. From what I could see, the neon god was still raging, bellowing loud curses through the shitty speakers of the cabinet. Dante pulled one of the quarters back from his pocket, walking toward it, and picking up one of the guns. At the time, I thought I was going crazy, but the god looked through the screen at him as he approached, roars and curses beginning to calm as a possible player approached. No way this thing was advanced enough to have any kind of sensor on it, but I swear it knew he was coming. He slipped the quarter in, squeezing the trigger to get past the title screen. The neon god howled with anticipation, a massive grin on its face as the runes grew brighter. The entire screen bloomed with the light before fading into something new. A dingy bathroom. The camera looked up into an empty mirror before looking back down at a sink. I didn't even realize I was walking toward the game for a better look at the time, but I was invested. As the camera panned down to the sink, it revealed a standard 9mm, which was promptly picked up before turning to the door. Dante readied himself, pointing the light gun at the screen, before the door was kicked open and the on-rail shooter began. There was just a normal woman sitting on a bed, looked like a dingy hotel, but she raised her hands in terror as the door burst forward. I was impressed. Haven't seen many FMV-style games with a shooter focus, but this one was nearly seamless. Nowhere near the horrors that Night Trap had put me through years ago, with cheesy acting and short, clipped reactions. This was smooth. Grainy, not great quality, of course, but smooth because I never noticed the scene clip. The woman on the bed started begging for her life, pleading that she would do anything to stay alive. Just let her go. Whoever they got to play her should have been paid well, or at least, I still hoped they were an actress. Her voice had genuine fear, actual panic that these were her last moments. This shit was Oscar-worthy. I'm not kidding. Dante only let her get a couple of lines out before delivering a headshot that would put Bud Dwyer to shame. The body slumped over, a small bit of blood visible over her right eye, as the player turns back to the bathroom, facing the mirror once again. This time, though, with a picture of Dante superimposed onto the body in the mirror. Pretty shittily, I'll add. This didn't look good, more comedic in just how bad of a job it did. The photo was low-res, colors all inverted by what I'm assuming was a screen hiding the camera. But it was Dante in the mirror nonetheless, his face stretched across the basic model of a human body, now raising the gun to his own temple. If I shoot myself, is it game over? Dad asked me. All I could do was shrug, though. still feeling uneasy about the woman he had just shot. Something about her pleas just felt too real. Freezy. Drop the gun. A voice came over the tinny speaker again. The player character does a swift turn, finally getting rid of that terrifying stretchy Dant face, and faces two cops with guns up. Drop the gun. Dant fires then, hitting one before the other hits him, sending him tumbling to the ground with a game over screen. Well, that was weird as asterisk. Dant said, shrugging and holstering the light gun. Not really sure what that has to do with a neon god. Yeah, that's not my thing, I said, shaking my head. Everything about the game just seemed off now. The screen was still active, one cop calling in backup for his partner that was bleeding on the ground a few feet away. The lighting on screen began to flicker, fading to red as lights began to flash through the motel door. Then it faded to black, returning to the screen where the neon god was before, now raging once more. The language was incomprehensible, but it was definitely angrier than before. Dant simply shrugged it off, moving back to the counter and taking his rental before giving me a wave and shouting a farewell. Awkward as ever. I couldn't get the woman out of my mind. The neon god just kept ranting on the screen, screaming in that unknown language, just guttural shouting. Sirens cut through my thought before I was even back to the counter. An ambulance and cop cars racing past Kells, heading down the road like the hounds of hell were on their asses. Before I knew it, they had turned a corner and were gone out of sight. But the wailing was still audible, fainter by the second. Things went to hell business-wise shortly after that, with seemingly half the town coming in to rent a video or game. Some kids stopped to play MVC2, but nobody really touched Neon God. Before I knew it, closing time had arrived, and it was time to lock up. I ended up having to wait out a few stragglers. One guy that was a little too indecisive about his dirty tapes ended up getting run out with none, but finally I was able to get the hell out. I was exhausted by that point. It wasn't until I read the newspaper the next morning that the uneasy feeling came back again. The front page had a story about the Old Cozy Inn, a motel a little ways from Kells closer to the main highway coming through. I needed to stop, he muttered, putting a coin into the slot and picking up the light gun. There was a small trickle of bright red coming from his nose, much brighter than blood's normal color. The neon god roared on screen, and I noticed the chains on its arms were finally broken, dangling off of his wrists. His ankles were still captive, and one around his neck looked like it was still hanging on relatively well, but the runes on his skin were glowing so much brighter than before. The void he was standing in was different too, seemingly filling with a substance that looked an awful lot like blood. As Dante squeezed the trigger, things changed, the screen flashing bright before going dark. It wasn't the bathroom of before, but this time a dark parking lot. There was someone sitting in a car just a few feet away. The player got out of their vehicle, ammo count appearing in the corner again, and began walking toward the parked car. They barely stopped before the two people in the car began screaming. Dant pulled off 2 shots, killing both despite their pleas, before the player character kept moving. It walked toward the building from the parking lot, sign becoming clearer as lights began to break through the dark. United Market. My blood ran cold when I recognized the sign, and Dant just kept on going, playing the game without giving it any mind. He stepped through the doors of the grocery store, walking into the grimy, dimly lit aisles. A worker stepped forward, asking if he was okay, before Dante emptied off another shot at him, catching him in the leg as he fell, scrambling behind a nearby aisle. "Dant, stop," I shouted, trying to wrestle the light gun away from him. He wouldn't budge though, shrugging me off. I went for another approach as he squeezed off another shot at someone who shouted at his in-game self. I recognized these people's voices, the same ones I heard when I would go grocery shopping for Mom. These were real people on that screen. Scrambling behind the cabinet, I kept trying to unplug it, but just couldn't get far enough behind to reach the damn cord. It was too heavy to move too, and the screams coming through the speakers only made my heart beat even faster. There's not telling how many people he had shot by now, but the bright trickle of blood from his nose was coming out faster now, dripping first on his shirt, then on the floor below. One option left. I ran into the back room and nearly ran into the breaker box, throwing it open and flipping the main switch. Lights went out and Dante screamed from out in the main room. No, he won't leave me alone until he's free. He ranted before I heard the light gun hit the screen on the cabinet, shattering it inward. No. Damn it. I grabbed a box cutter from the shelf nearby, keeping it held in front of me with no idea of what Dante could do. The entire shop was dark, but I could hear him bumping into the wall as he tried to find his way back toward me, likely wanting to turn the power back on. I held my breath, hoping he wouldn't be able to hear my heart beating through my damn chest as he thumped around the back room. A metal shelf fell, making him scream out in pain. Working with the dark, I slid my way through the back room of the shop, away from the breakers, and toward the back door nearby. I would slip out that way, get to my car, and get the hell out of here. Cops could pick Dante up for trespassing or whatever, but I wasn't dealing with it. I saw his pasty face in the dark charging toward me like a damn disembodied head, a phantom ready to take my soul. He was screaming, but I could *kicking swear that his blood was glowing, almost neon, and now not only coming from his nose, but the corner of his eyes. Both eyes were bloodshot by now, but the way his blood was lighting up like a strip club sign, it was like a damned vampire in the dark. He charged toward me, making me dive off to the side and knock into the back door hard. The metal bar dug into my back, almost making me scream out as I pushed against it, limping out into the brisk night air. It was dark, but I could hear him coming from behind, hitting the door and lunging out after me. His voice was almost feral now, a deep primal violence emanating from his throat. Moments after I rounded the corner to the parking lot, a blinding light shined on me, making me stumble over a stone parking spot liner and hit my knee hard on the concrete. Turning to raise my box cutter at Dante, I was surprised to see something hit him right in the chest, causing him to fall over. He shook for a minute before stopping, and a man in a suit came over to check his pulse before picking him up. I looked over to see two huge vans, bright lights atop one of them, sitting in the parking lot. Another man in a suit came forward, offering a hand to pull me up off the ground. I had seen men in black earlier that year, so I was pretty quick to ask if that's what these guys were. They fit the stereotype at least, with the black suits on and mysterious vibe. Unmarked vans didn't help either. The guy just introduced himself as Peters, said he was part of something called The Collective, and started asking me if I knew anything about the violence around town. I knew that nobody would ever take me seriously, but this guy actually seemed serious. Everything about Neon God came rushing out, from the odd appearance of it to how everything in it seemed way too real. The guy just nodded along, confirming everything I said while taking some notes. After about 20 minutes, though, an old, beat-up truck rolled up, and a new horror began. Cal arrived, cranky-ass old redneck as he was, and ever the businessman. He only wanted to know why his business was closed when it was supposed to be open. Wasn't until he got a good look at the guys in suits that he puckered up a little bit. Calvin Seppel, Peters asked. He only nodded. Been a while. We have a few things we need to discuss. Yeah, like higher pay for watching this place. Calvin muttered back. Peters sighed, turning back to me. I'm going to have to apologize. It seems you and others have been put in danger. We'll get things taken care of. You can go home, he said, extending a hand for a handshake. I'll also make sure Mr. Seppel is adequately compensating you for your risk. Risk. The ache in my knee was screaming by that point, and I was starting to get frustrated. These people were telling me things without actually telling me anything about what the hell happened. Peters sighed again, looking at me directly. If you have any other things you'd like to report about your time here, by all means, he said, direct this time. That was it. The floodgate was open. I told him all about everything. The tapes, the corrupted game, all of it. He just kept growing more pale as I told him more. By the end of it, he called one of his friends over, whispering to them something about a quarantine before they nodded, walking away. Look, if I'm going to be working for shit pay, at least tell me I'm not going to die doing it. I'd join the military if I wanted that, I said. He simply shook his head, motioning for me to follow him inside. The lights had been turned back on by that point. Glass from the screen was shattered on the Neon God cabinet, yet there was still the sound of rage coming from the speaker. Despite being broken seemingly beyond repair, the Neon God was still demanding his freedom. We walked past it, though, into the adults-only room where the man pushed a poster on the wall, pressing right on a blonde woman's massive chest and causing a panel to slide away. He motioned me inside before pressing a small button. The elevator began to lower. Worked here long? Peters asked me. I nodded. A year or so. Good. Plan on being here for a while? He asked again. Depends on what you're about to show me, I replied. The lift door dinged then, opening to a massive empty space below the video shop. There was a small door about 50 feet away across the room, but with no handle to open it. That right there, Peters began, is what we call an aberration. Okay, I said, just staring at it. It's a door to nowhere and everywhere. Depends on the day. He continued his story, stepping out of the lift and moving towards a panel on the wall. The dark, dimly lit room looked creepy, yellow wallpaper peeling and absorbing the light with an eerie tint. Peters started fiddling with something inside the wall panel, pulling a small part from his suit pocket to replace a part inside the wiring. Now it looks like the dampener hasn't been doing great. Things should calm down from here on out. He stepped back, pressing a button and watching the panel suddenly light up green. Fantastic, all fixed, he said, entering the lift with me again. Sometimes the door leaks, things get through. Not actual physical things, mind you, just things that can corrupt. You don't have to worry about all the strangeness anymore, just needed a replacement part. The lift went back up. My mind was racing at his explanation, and I think that's what he was counting on. The men in black have their little mind eraser, but that's just flashy tech. In reality, nobody's going to *King, believe me, because this all sounds so insane. Peters was practically laughing at it by time we got back to the surface. Just keep an eye on things. If there's more we're cleared to tell you, you'll know, he said. Neon God was getting loaded into their van now. Cal arguing with them that they better reimburse him for taking an item he bought legally. Peters guided me to my car, waving me off. There were 3 deaths that day, and pretty sure about a dozen people ended up hospitalized, all from that damned game. I saw Peters again a few times, but that bastard never gave me a straight answer on anything. Cal didn't show his face around the shop again for weeks either. Meanwhile, all I could think about was that door downstairs and whatever may be behind it. Not a leaf remains as it was. The first time I met Emily was a cool spring afternoon. I was walking alone through the park, still adjusting to the new town. When I saw her, she was standing on the bridge overlooking the creek, tossing pebbles into the water one at a time. Her hair was messy, tied back with a fraying green ribbon, and her sneakers were caked with mud. "Why do you think the trees whisper?" she asked without looking at me. I paused, unsure if she was even talking to me. "Oh, the wind." She shook her head, tossing another pebble. "Nah, I think it's ghosts." She finally turned to face me, her eyes bright and curious. "You believe in ghosts?" "I don't know," I said. "Do you?" She shrugged. "Maybe. There's something about this place, though. Feels like something's watching, doesn't it?" I looked around, but all I saw were the trees and the path stretching into the distance. Not really. She smiled, a crooked little grin that made it feel like I'd already lost whatever game we were playing. "Guess you're not paying attention." That was Emily. always saying things that made me feel like I was a step behind her. I didn't mind, though. It didn't take long for us to become friends. We started meeting at the park after school, walking the same trail every time. Emily was like no one I'd ever met. Bold, funny, always teetering on the edge of something wild. She talked about ghosts and curses and other ridiculous things like they were real, but she also had this way of making the world seem brighter, less heavy. And the park was strange. The trees hung low over the path, their branches tangled together like they were keeping secrets. The air was always cooler there, even in the summer. And the leaves, those deep red, almost black leaves, lined the trail no matter the season. Why are they so dark? I asked her once. She bent down to pick one up, twirling it between her fingers. Because they're dead, she said, dropping it. But they don't know it yet. I laughed, but the way she said it made the hair on my arms stand up. By fall, I knew I loved her. It wasn't just the way she smiled, or how she could make anything, even math class, fun. It was how she made me feel less invisible, like I mattered. I wanted to tell her, but I never quite found the courage. The last time I saw her, we were walking the trail as usual. She was quieter than normal, her hands stuffed into her jacket pockets. You ever think about running away? She asked suddenly. Running away from what? She kicked at a pile of leaves, scattering them across the path. I don't know. Just everything. School, parents, all of it. Where would you go? Anywhere. She stopped and looked at me, her eyes serious. Would you come with me? I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell her I'd go anywhere she wanted, but the words got caught in my throat. She smiled, soft and sad, and said, "Just kidding," before walking ahead. Later, I realized she wasn't kidding. Not really. Her parents fought all the time. Loud, bitter arguments that echoed through the walls of their house. She told me, in bits and pieces, how she felt like she was always the one trying to fix things, like she was responsible for their happiness. She'd never said it outright, but I think she wanted to escape more than she let on. That was why she was always at the park, why she never stayed home for long. That night, I dreamed about the park. The leaves were everywhere, swirling around me, pulling me deeper into the woods. The air was thick, and the trees seemed to lean closer, their branches reaching for me. I woke up in a cold sweat, my chest tight. The blue nighttime sky was visible through the crack in my curtains, a deep, dark expanse that seemed to stretch forever. The shadows in my room were too thick, and my mind was still stuck in the dream. I needed something real, something that would ground me back in the waking world. I stood up, stumbling towards the window, the dream still heavy on me. My hands gripped the curtain, pulling it aside, and for a moment, the chill of the night air touched my skin. Outside, the street was covered in those same crimson leaves. They were everywhere, all the way down the road, piled up like a blanket. I froze. My heart started to pound. I went to school the next morning like nothing was wrong. Emily wasn't in homeroom, but that wasn't unusual. She skipped sometimes when she felt like it. I figured I'd see her at lunch, and when I didn't, I told myself she was just avoiding me. Maybe I'd said something wrong the day before. It wasn't until I got home that I found out she was missing. My mom was on the phone with Emily's mom, her voice low and urgent. She never came home, she said, her eyes darting to me. The police are looking, but the rest of her sentence was drowned out by the roaring in my ears. The days after Emily disappeared were a blur. The park was swarming with cops, their voices crackling over radios as they searched the woods. The school was quiet, heavy with whispers and rumors. Do you think she ran away? Maybe she had a boyfriend no one knew about. What if someone, took her? I hated them all for talking about her like that, like she was just another story to pass the time. My parents didn't know what to do with me. They tried to talk to me, to ask how I was feeling, but I didn't have the words to explain it. The world felt gray, dull, like someone had turned the volume all the way down. And the leaves, they were everywhere. On the path to school, in the gutters, even on my shoes. I couldn't escape them, no matter where I went. I started skipping school, wandering the park for hours, hoping I'd find something the cops had missed. I knew it was stupid, but I couldn't sit at home and do nothing. One afternoon, I saw it, a trail of leaves stretching deeper into the woods than I'd ever gone before. They weren't scattered like usual. They were lined up, leading somewhere. I followed them. The deeper I went, the quieter the world became. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under my feet, and even that felt muted. Finally, I saw it, a small, crumbling cabin hidden among the trees. The door was ajar, and the leaves spilled inside like they were beckoning me. My hands were shaking as I stepped inside. The smell hit me first, rotting leaves and something worse, something sharp and metallic. And then I saw her. She was lying in the corner, her body pale and still. Her hair was tangled with leaves, and her eyes, they were open, staring at nothing. My breath hitched, and for a moment, I thought I was dreaming. Maybe this was all a mistake, but there she was, Emily, just like I remembered her, but wrong. So wrong. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My chest felt like it was caving in. I didn't know how long I sat there, just staring at her, but eventually I heard voices in the distance, the sound of footsteps, of people calling her name. The police found me in the cabin, staring at Emily's body. I don't know how long I was there. I couldn't tell them anything, not the way I wanted to. My words felt like they were all tangled up, and nothing made sense. They said they found the man a few days later. He was a drifter, living on the outskirts of town for years, using the park as a hideout. They said he'd been watching Emily for months, but I didn't care about his story. What mattered was that he had ruined everything. When they found him, they said his hands were dirty, covered in soil and leaves. His backpack was full of them, crammed in tight, as if he had been collecting them for a long time. I didn't know what to think. They said he was crazy, a loner, but none of it mattered. Emily was gone. I don't know how to explain it, but Emily's death changed something in me. There was a deep, gnawing emptiness, like a part of me had been ripped out and left behind in the woods. The leaves kept falling every autumn. They'd cover the paths, cover the trail, and I would look at them, frozen for minutes on end. But they weren't just leaves anymore. They were a reminder. They were a mark. The cops found the man. They called him insane, but none of it mattered. Emily was gone, and the leaves were still there, falling quietly, as if they'd always been. I've worked in a lighthouse for 10 years. Something in the fog wants in. The thing about lighthouses is that they're supposed to guide people safely to shore. But what no one tells you is that they also warn you about what not to approach. I learned this the hard way. For the past 10 years, I've been the keeper of an old lighthouse perched on the edge of a jagged cliff somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. It's isolated, just me, the waves, and the fog. The fog, it's always there. People think lighthouses are romantic places, but I can tell you this, being alone for weeks at a time, with only the sound of foghorns and crashing waves, can make your mind play tricks on you. But I'm not crazy, I swear. It started 3 months ago, on a night when the fog was so thick it felt like it had weight. I'd done my rounds, made sure the light was functioning, and was sitting down for a late dinner when I heard it. A faint tapping at the window. The thing is, my living quarters are 70 feet off the ground. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate. Tap, 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 like fingers on glass. At first, I thought it was a bird, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there, just the fog pressing against the panes. Still, I felt, watched. I shook it off, chalked it up to my imagination, and went to bed. The tapping became a nightly occurrence, always at the same time, 11:15 p.m. Sometimes it was soft, like a polite knock. Other times, it was frantic, like someone desperate to be let in. I stopped looking out the window. I didn't want to know. One night, the foghorn malfunctioned. I climbed the spiral stairs to check the mechanism, and as I reached the top, I saw it. A shadow moving through the fog, too tall and too thin to be human. It moved with an unnatural grace, gliding rather than walking. My breath caught in my throat. It stopped just at the edge of the light's reach, as if the beam was a barrier it couldn't cross. Then it turned its head, or what I think was its head, toward me. Even through the fog, I could feel its gaze. Cold, hungry. I stumbled back down the stairs, locking every door behind me. That night, the tapping didn't come from the window. It came from the door. I reported the incident to my supervisor the next day. He laughed it off, said isolation can make people see things. "You're just imagining it," he said. "The fog does weird things to sound and light." But I know what I saw. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. The foghorn would cut out randomly, plunging the area into silence. The light would flicker, casting shadows that didn't match the objects around them. And the tapping? It started coming from inside the lighthouse. One night, I woke up to a scratching sound behind the wall. My room is solid brick. There's nothing back there, but the sound was insistent, like nails raking across the mortar. When I pressed my ear to the wall, I swear I heard breathing. 2 weeks ago, a storm rolled in. The waves were massive, crashing against the cliffs with enough force to shake the lighthouse. The fog was thicker than ever, the beam of light barely penetrating it. That's when the voices started. They came from the radio, crackling and distorted. At first, it sounded like static, but then I heard words. "Let us in. We're cold. Let us in." Over and over, like a chant. I yanked the plug out of the wall, but the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, overlapping until they were deafening. I ran to the lantern room, hoping the light would keep whatever it was at bay. As I climbed the stairs, I heard footsteps below me. Heavy, deliberate. I reached the top and slammed the hatch shut, locking myself inside. The fog pressed against the glass, swirling like it was alive. And then I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, moving through the fog. They surrounded the lighthouse, their faces indistinct but wrong. Their mouths opened wider than should be possible, emitting a low guttural hum that vibrated in my chest. One of them reached out, pressing a long, spindly hand against the glass. It left a smear of darkness, like oil. The light flickered and went out. I don't remember how long I stayed up there, clutching a wrench and staring into the void. When dawn came, the fog had receded, and the figures were gone. But the smear on the glass remained. I've tried reporting these incidents, but no one believes me. The closest town thinks I'm just the crazy lighthouse keeper. My supervisor told me to take a vacation, but I can't leave. I don't think the fog will let me. Last night, the tapping came back, but this time it was accompanied by a voice, a low, whispering voice that said, "You can't keep us out forever." And they're right. The light stopped working this morning. The foghorn won't sound. The fog is creeping closer, thicker than I've ever seen it. I can hear them now, moving through the fog, their voices blending into the wind. They want in, and I don't know if I can stop them. I found a hidden door in my basement. It wasn't meant for me last month. I moved into a century-old house on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place that realtors sell by calling it full of character, creaky floors, dimly lit hallways, and a basement that smelled like mold and regret. I was told the house had been empty for years, but I didn't ask why. I just wanted an affordable place to live. The basement was a nightmare from the start. Damp concrete walls, a single flickering bulb, and a feeling that you weren't alone. But it was the only place with enough space to store my boxes, so I made peace with its bad vibes. At least I thought I had. Until the night I found the door. It started with the noise. A faint scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across wood, woke me up at 2:13 a.m. I brushed it off as the house settling. until it happened again the next night, and the next. Finally, I grabbed a flashlight and headed down to the basement, determined to find the source. The scraping was louder in the basement, coming from behind one of the walls. I followed the sound and noticed something strange. One part of the wall had seams that didn't match the rest, as if it had been patched up hastily. The more I stared at it, the more it looked wrong, like it didn't belong there. I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed a crowbar and started prying at the seams. The drywall gave way easily, revealing a small wooden door about 3 feet high. It had no handle, just a series of strange carvings burned into the wood, symbols that looked ancient, almost alive. I felt sick just looking at them, but the scraping sound had stopped, and the silence was worse. I should have left it alone. I should have turned around, walked back upstairs, and sealed that wall forever. But something about the door pulled at me, like it wanted to be opened. I reached out, and the moment my fingers touched the wood, the carvings began to glow. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a pitch-black tunnel that stretched far beyond the boundaries of my house. The air that spilled out smelled of decay and something metallic, like old blood. My flashlight flickered as I aimed it into the darkness, and that's when I saw them. Handprints, hundreds of them, pressed into the walls of the tunnel. They weren't painted or carved. They were scorched into the stone, each one larger than the last, as if something was crawling deeper and deeper. I stepped back, slamming the door shut, but the glow from the carvings seeped through the cracks. Then I heard it, a voice, faint and crackling, like it was coming from an old radio. "Help me. It's so dark." It wasn't a stranger's voice. It was mine. That was a week ago. The door won't close anymore. Every time I go into the basement, it's slightly ajar, and the tunnel seems darker, deeper. Last night, I heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. Something is coming out of the tunnel, and it knows my name. If you're reading this, don't try to help me. Don't come looking for this house. I think the door was never meant for me. I think it was meant for you.